Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Belmont Grand reopened its doors after a century of silence on a Tuesday night in October, though reopened was generous. Most of the hotel remained shrouded in scaffolding and renovation dust, accessible only to contractors and the skeleton crew of security personnel tasked with monitoring the restoration. I was the newest addition to that crew, night manager they called it, though the title felt hollow when there were no guests to manage, only shadows and the persistent whisper of wind through gaps in the old window frames. The job came with a single, non-negotiable requirement: conduct hourly security rounds through the accessible portions of the building. The route was predetermined, marked on a laminated floor plan that had seen better decades. Lobby, east wing corridor, service elevator to the second floor, west wing corridor, back down via the main staircase. 15 minutes if I moved at a steady pace. 45 minutes to kill until the next round. It was on my third night that I first noticed something peculiar about the mirrors. The east wing corridor on the second floor stretched nearly the length of a city block, lined on both sides with identical guest room doors. Between every third door hung an ornate mirror, each one a masterpiece of gilded craftsmanship that spoke to the hotel's former grandeur. The restoration team had already cleaned and polished them to a shine that seemed almost supernatural in the dim emergency lighting. I was halfway down the corridor, checking door locks with mechanical precision, when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in mirror number 4. Nothing unusual. A tall figure in a Navy security uniform, flashlight in hand, clipboard tucked under one arm. But as I continued walking, something nagged at me. I glanced back at the mirror. My reflection was still there. Not just there. It was still walking the route I'd taken 3 seconds earlier, checking the lock on room 247 while I stood near room 253. I watched, frozen, as my mirrored self completed the action I'd already finished, then continued forward to catch up with my real position. The rational explanation came immediately: fatigue. 3 nights of disrupted sleep schedule, adjusting to nocturnal hours after years of day shifts. Peripheral vision playing tricks, that's all. The mind filling in gaps, creating continuity where none existed. I continued my rounds. But the next night, I paid closer attention to the mirrors. And the night after that, the delay was consistent, roughly 4 seconds. Mirror me always lagged behind, performing actions I'd already completed. Checking locks, making notes on my clipboard, adjusting my belt where the master keys hung in their leather case. At first, the discrepancy seemed like nothing more than a curious optical illusion, the kind of thing you might mention to a colleague over coffee if you had colleagues who worked your shift. By the end of the first week, I realized the delay was increasing. 6 seconds, then 8. Mirror me wasn't just lagging. It was falling further behind with each passing night, as if whatever force governed the reflection operated on a different temporal frequency than reality. I began timing it obsessively, counting Mississippi seconds while walking the corridor, watching my delayed double perform a pantomime of my own movements. The differences were subtle at first. Minor variations in posture, the angle of my flashlight beam, the way I held my clipboard. Easy to dismiss as perception distortion or the accumulated fatigue of sleepless nights. But on Friday of my second week, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mirror me's uniform was different, not dramatically. The shirt was the same navy blue, the pants identical, but the name badge was missing. In reality, I wore a simple plastic rectangle with David Torres, night manager, printed in block letters. My reflection wore a blank shirt, pristine and unmarked. I stood in front of mirror number 7, raising my hand to touch the badge on my chest. In the reflection, my hand moved to the same position, but found nothing there. The action looked strange, purposeless, like someone scratching an itch that didn't exist. That was when I started keeping a journal. October 23rd, delay now approximately 10 seconds. Reflection missing name badge, confirmed multiple times from different angles. October 24th, Delay 12 seconds. Badge still missing. Noticed reflections pockets appear empty despite carrying keys, coins, and security checklist in reality. October 25th, 15-second delay. Attempted to document with phone camera, but security protocol prohibits personal devices during rounds. Will investigate hotel history tomorrow. The Belmont Grand's archives were stored in the basement, accessible through a service corridor that smelled of mildew and industrial cleaner. Mrs. Chen, the day shift supervisor, had given me permission to research the building's background for my own peace of mind. She seemed to understand that working alone in a century-old building could prey on a person's imagination. The files painted a picture of faded elegance. The Belmont had been the crown jewel of the city's hospitality industry throughout the early 1900s, hosting presidents and celebrities, grand balls and business conferences. The record showed steady operation until 1919, then an abrupt cessation of business in early 1920. No explanation was given for the closure, just a final entry dated February 14, 1920. Operations suspended indefinitely. What caught my attention were the architectural diagrams. The second-floor layout showed the east wing corridor exactly as it existed today, complete with the placement of each mirror. But there was a note scrawled in the margin, barely legible after a century. Mirror installation delayed. Staff reports unusual acoustic phenomena. I photographed the document with my personal phone, then spent the rest of my day shift researching acoustic phenomena in historical buildings. Most of what I found was mundane: settling foundations, thermal expansion, wind patterns creating resonance in hollow spaces. But buried in a forum dedicated to paranormal investigation, I found a reference to temporal echo chambers, spaces where sound or light might become trapped and replay at delayed intervals. It was pseudoscience, the kind of thing that belonged in late-night cable documentaries rather than serious research. But it provided a framework for understanding what I was experiencing, even if that framework existed outside the boundaries of accepted physics. October 30th, delay now 18 seconds. Reflection lacks all personal items, empty pockets, no keys, no clipboard. Research suggests possible acoustic optical echo phenomenon, beginning to feel watched during rounds. The sensation of being observed had crept up gradually, like the slow onset of illness. At first, it was just an occasional prickle between my shoulder blades, the kind of thing that made you turn around expecting to find someone behind you. But as the mirror delays lengthened, the feeling intensified. I wasn't alone in the corridor. Not exactly, but I wasn't entirely alone either. It was the mirrors themselves that seemed to watch. Not my reflection. That poor delayed bastard was still going through the motions of security rounds from nearly 20 seconds in the past. Something else lived in the silver backing, something that observed my nightly routine with what felt like growing interest. The sensation was strongest near mirror number 12, positioned at the far end of the corridor where the shadows pooled deepest. I'd begun unconsciously quickening my pace when passing that particular mirror, but on Halloween night, professional obligation forced me to stop there. The lock on room 284 was loose, not broken, but loose enough to warrant a maintenance request. I stood in front of the problematic door, clipboard in hand, writing a detailed description of the issue. In my peripheral vision, mirror number 12 reflected my actions from 23 seconds earlier, me checking the lock on room 281, finding it secure, moving on to the next door. As I wrote, something changed in the quality of light around me. The emergency lighting flickered just for a moment, but in that instant of dimness, I saw something in mirror 12 that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing behind me. Not my delayed reflection. That was still 3 doors back, methodically checking locks. This was someone else entirely, positioned close enough that I should have felt their breath on my neck. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. The corridor was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, my own face stared back at me with an expression of absolute terror. But it wasn't my current face. It was the face I'd worn 23 seconds earlier, before I'd seen the figure. My reflection was afraid of something that hadn't happened yet. November 1st, experienced possible hallucination during rounds. Reflection showing emotional states from past moments. Delay now 23 seconds. Considering request for transfer. I should have requested that transfer. Should have walked into Mrs. Chen's office the next morning and explained that the isolation was getting to me, that I needed to work somewhere with more people, more light, more connection to the normal world. But there was something addictive about the mystery, something that pulled me back to that corridor night after night. The mirrors had become a puzzle to solve, and I'd never been good at leaving puzzles unfinished. November brought longer nights and colder air that seemed to seep through the building's bones. The restoration work had slowed, leaving whole sections of the hotel in a state of suspended animation. During my rounds, I began to notice other discrepancies beyond the mirrors. Doors that I'd checked and found locked would be standing slightly ajar on my return trip. Temperature fluctuations that had no correlation to the building's HVAC system. The persistent sound of footsteps from the floor above, despite the fact that the third floor remained sealed off for asbestos remediation. But it was the mirrors that held my attention. The delay had stabilized at 25 seconds, and my reflection had taken on an increasingly distant quality. Mirror me moved with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions they'd performed thousands of times, checking locks that weren't there, writing notes on a clipboard that existed only in the past. On November 8th, I noticed that my reflection had stopped looking at me. Throughout the weeks of delayed mirroring, my reflected self had occasionally made eye contact with my real self, creating moments of disorienting connection across the temporal gap. But now Mirror Me stared straight ahead, focused on some point beyond the glass that I couldn't see. When I moved closer to the mirrors, trying to catch my reflection's attention, the figure in the glass continued its rounds with the oblivious determination of sleepwalker. The change filled me with an inexplicable sense of loss. My reflection had become my only companion during those long nights, even if it was a companion who lived in the past. Now I was truly alone in the corridor, watched only by whatever presence lurked in the deeper shadows of the mirrors. November 12th. Reflection no longer acknowledges real-time self. Delay steady at 25 seconds. Beginning to question whether delayed figure is actually my reflection or something else entirely. The question haunted me. What if the figure in the mirrors wasn't my reflection at all, but something else that had learned to mimic my movements? Something that had been trapped in the hotel's mirrors since 1920, studying the security rounds night after night, perfecting its imitation of human behavior? I began varying my routine, making small changes to test whether the mirror figure would follow suit. I'd skip a door, or check them in reverse order, or pause to examine a piece of trim that didn't need examining. 25 seconds later, I'd watch the mirrors to see if my reflection performed the same variations. It did. Every time. The figure in the glass matched my movements with precise temporal delay, no matter how arbitrary or meaningless those movements were. But there was something mechanical about the way it moved. Something that spoke of performance, rather than genuine action. On November 15th, I realized what was bothering me about my reflection's behavior. It never made mistakes. When I fumbled with my keys, dropping them and having to pick them up, my reflection performed the same sequence flawlessly, as if the fumble had been choreographed. When I lost my balance slightly on a wet spot on the floor, my reflection executed a perfectly controlled recovery, never showing the moment of genuine uncertainty that had gripped me. My reflection had become too good at being me. November 18th. Reflection exhibits impossible perfection in duplicating actions. No hesitation, no mistakes, no genuine human uncertainty. Growing suspicion that figure in mirrors is not reflection at all. The revelation came on November 20th at 3:17 a.m. as I reached for my key ring to check the lock on room 267. The keys weren't there. I patted my belt, checking each loop and clip where the key ring normally hung. Nothing. I checked my pockets, my jacket, the floor around my feet. The keys were simply gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. But in mirror number 9, I could see them clearly. My reflection was checking the lock on room 264, 25 seconds behind my current position, and the keys hung prominently from its belt. As I watched, Mirror Me completed its check and moved on to room 265, the keys swaying with each step, solid and real and impossibly present in a world I could see but not touch. I followed my reflection's progress, walking parallel to it as it continued its delayed route. At room 266, Mirror Me paused and looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. Its eyes, my eyes, held an expression of profound sadness, as if it understood something that I was only beginning to grasp. Then Mirror Me reached down and unclipped the keyring from its belt. The keys fell to the floor of the reflected corridor with a metallic clink that I could hear despite the barrier of glass and time. They landed at the base of mirror number 9 and stayed there, visible in the reflection but absent from reality. I pressed my hands against the mirror's surface, feeling nothing but cold glass beneath my palms. The keys lay just inches away, in a space that existed 25 seconds in the past, and perhaps an entirely different dimension of reality. November 20th. Keys have fallen into mirror world, still visible in reflection but absent from reality. Growing certainty that part of myself has become trapped in hotel's temporal echo. Must find way to retrieve lost elements before more disappears. The loss of the keys was just the beginning. Over the following nights, other items began to migrate from reality into the mirror world. My clipboard vanished next, followed by my pen, then my security badge. Each item fell away from my physical form and landed in the reflected corridor, creating a growing collection of objects that existed only in the past. But the most disturbing change was in my reflection itself. As items disappeared from my person, they appeared on the figure in the mirrors. Mirror Me now carried the complete set of tools and accessories that had once defined my role as night manager, while I walked the corridor increasingly empty-handed. The figure in the mirrors was becoming more real while I became less so. I stopped writing in my journal when the pen disappeared, stopped checking locks when the keys vanished. My security rounds became a hollow pantomime of their former purpose, a meaningless walk through corridors I could no longer secure or properly document. Meanwhile, Mirror Me continued to perform its duties with increasing competence. It checked locks with authority, made notes with confidence, carried itself with the bearing of someone who belonged in the role of night manager. The temporal delay remained constant, but the quality of the reflection had changed. It moved with purpose while I drifted like a ghost through my own life. On November 28th, I understood what was happening. The hotel was completing my replacement. The Belmont Grand had been closed since 1920, its staff dismissed, its operations suspended. But buildings like the Belmont didn't simply shut down. They continued to exist, continued to need care and attention. The hotel had been waiting nearly a century for someone to fill the role of night manager, and now it was extracting that role from me piece by piece, creating a permanent guardian who would never leave, never age, never abandon his post. The figure in the mirrors wasn't my reflection. It was my replacement, assembled from the parts of myself that the hotel deemed essential. My sense of duty, my dedication to routine, my willingness to walk empty corridors in the dead of night. All of these qualities were being siphoned away and concentrated in the mirror world, leaving behind an increasingly hollow version of myself. I tried to break the pattern, tried to skip my rounds, to abandon the route that had become as automatic as breathing, but my feet carried me to the East Wing corridor regardless of my conscious intentions. The hotel's needs had become my needs, its schedule my schedule. I was no longer performing security rounds. The rounds were performing me. November 30th. Entry made with borrowed pen from day shift. Complete understanding now achieved. Hotel is harvesting functional aspects of my personality to create permanent night manager. Process appears irreversible. Physical body remains but essential self migrating to mirror world. Time remaining uncertain. December brought snow and the final phase of my dissolution. The distinction between my physical form and my mirror image blurred until I could no longer tell which version of myself was real. Sometimes I would find myself checking locks in the reflection while my body stood motionless in the corridor. Other times, I would walk the route in reality, while my consciousness observed from within the mirrors. The temporal delay had become meaningless. Past and present existed simultaneously, separated only by the thin barrier of silvered glass. I could see Mrs. Chen arriving for her morning shift, but I could also see the original staff of the Belmont Grand going about their duties in 1920. Time had become a stack of transparent sheets, each layer visible through the others. On December 14th, exactly 94 days after I'd first noticed the delayed reflections, I completed my final round as a physical entity. I stood at the end of the East Wing corridor, looking back at mirror number 12, and saw myself walking toward the exit. But I was no longer walking. I was standing at the mirror watching myself leave. The transfer was complete. I exist now in the space between seconds, in the pause between one moment and the next. I conduct my rounds with perfect efficiency, checking locks that never fail, making notes that never fade, carrying keys that never break. The hotel is secure under my watch, and it always will be. Sometimes I see other people in the corridor, restoration workers, new security personnel, visitors taking tours of the historic Belmont Grand. They pass through my world like figures in a dream, solid enough to cast shadows but too distant to touch. Occasionally, one of them notices the mirrors and comments on how clear the reflections are, how lifelike the images seem. They don't understand that there's no reflection in these mirrors anymore. Only reality, operating on its own timeline, maintaining its own schedule. The Belmont Grand has found its permanent night manager, and I have found my permanent home. The delay has ended. I am precisely where I need to be, precisely when I need to be there. I check the locks, make my notes, carry my keys. The corridor stretches ahead of me and behind me, an endless loop of purpose and responsibility. I am David Torres, night manager of the Belmont Grand Hotel. I have been here since 1920, and I will be here forever. The mirrors reflect only truth now, and the truth is simple. Some jobs are too important to leave unfilled. The hotel is secure. It always has been. It always will be. My rounds continue. Story 2. The basement studio breathed differently at 4 in the morning. I'd noticed it first 3 weeks ago, when insomnia drove me down the narrow stairs to my grandfather's old workshop, now my sanctuary of cables, monitors, and acoustic foam. The air moved with purpose down there, circulating in patterns that defied the sealed windows and the ancient furnace that hadn't run in years. It wasn't the gentle circulation of central air. This was something deliberate, something that seemed to watch me as I worked. My fingers found the familiar weight of the guitar, muscle memory guiding them through the opening progression of what would become echoes in static. The melody had been haunting me for days, fragments emerging during mundane moments, washing dishes, brushing my teeth, staring at the ceiling when sleep wouldn't come. Now, in the blue glow of my monitors, it finally took shape. The recording setup was simple, but professional. Grandpa's inheritance had been generous enough to let me pursue music full-time, and I'd invested in quality equipment. Audio interface, condenser mic, studio monitors that could pick up the subtlest harmonics. Everything was calibrated, tested, familiar, which made what happened next all the more unsettling. I pressed record and let the melody flow. The guitar sang through the space, each note crisp and clean in my headphones. But as I reached the bridge, something shifted. A resonance I didn't recognize began threading through the music. Not feedback, not electrical interference, but something organic. Something that seemed to anticipate my playing. When I stopped and played back the recording, my blood turned to ice water. There it was. A second channel I hadn't opened. A track I hadn't created. The organ sound was unmistakable. Deep, ecclesiastical, with that hollow quality that speaks of stone cathedrals and centuries of accumulated prayer. It followed my melody note for note, but with subtle variations that suggested improvisation rather than mimicry. I checked every input, every setting. Nothing. No additional tracks in my digital audio workstation. No open channels. No explanation for the phantom musician that had joined my late-night session. The logical mind searches for rational explanations first. Radio interference, perhaps. Some distant AM station bleeding through my equipment. I spent the next hour running tests, checking frequencies, examining every cable connection. The phantom track remained. stubbornly present in the recording but absent from any live monitoring. That's when I decided to dig deeper into the audio spectrum, loading the file into a frequency analyzer that could show me things beyond human hearing. The visual representation bloomed across my screen in bands of color and intensity. And there, buried beneath the threshold of perception, something made my hands shake. Subsonic frequencies, below 20 hertz, formed patterns too precise to be accidental. The oscilloscope showed regular pulses, and when I isolated and amplified them, slowing the playback to make the inaudible audible, I heard something that shouldn't exist. My name. Spoken in a voice that carried the weight of years, syllables drawn out and distorted, but unmistakably forming the letters of my full name. Michael. Adrian. Thornfield. The voice repeated it like a mantra, like a prayer, like a summoning. I ripped off my headphones and stumbled backward from the console. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the acoustic foam on the walls pressing inward like the soft interior of a coffin. The air moved against my neck, that cold current I'd noticed before, but now it felt intentional, like breath held too long and finally released. Sleep became elusive after that discovery. During the day, I could rationalize it away. Old house, old wiring, maybe electromagnetic interference from the power grid. Maybe I was pushing myself too hard, spending too many hours alone in the basement, letting isolation play tricks on my perception. But rationalization crumbled when darkness fell, and I found myself drawn back to the studio, compelled by the unfinished song. The entity, I'd started thinking of it in those terms, though I hated myself for the word, seemed to grow bolder with each session. The organ accompaniment became more elaborate, more confident. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't exist under the even LED lighting. The cold air currents became more frequent, more deliberate, as if something were pacing behind me while I played. I began leaving audio recorders running throughout the day, hoping to catch evidence of supernatural activity. What I found was worse than ghost voices or spectral music. I found gaps, sections where the digital files had been altered, where my voice had been removed and replaced with something else. Not the organ tones. Those remained audible, present, undeniable. But my vocals, my words, my thoughts given sound, had been systematically edited out and replaced with variations that were almost right, but fundamentally wrong. The melody remained the same. The timing stayed perfect. But the voice singing my lyrics wasn't quite my voice anymore. It carried inflections I didn't use, emotional colorings that felt foreign. When I played these altered recordings for friends, they couldn't hear the difference. To them, it sounded exactly like Michael Thornfield singing his original compositions. But I knew better. I could hear the infiltration, the subtle theft of my artistic identity. The realization that the entity wanted to collaborate came during a particularly late session, around 5 in the morning. I'd been working on a new piece, something darker and more complex than my usual style. The organ accompaniment had been present from the first chord, no longer hiding behind the threshold of perception, but joining the music openly, confidently. When I stopped playing, the organ continued. It played variations on my theme, explorations and embellishments that were genuinely beautiful. This wasn't mimicry or interference. This was musical conversation. The entity was offering its own ideas, its own interpretation of what we'd created together. The word "together" sent chills down my spine. I hadn't agreed to this partnership. I hadn't invited this presence into my music, my home, my creative process. Yet here it was, demonstrating skill and artistry that I had to admit surpassed my own. I spoke aloud for the first time, feeling ridiculous but needing to assert some kind of boundary. I told the empty studio that I worked alone, that I didn't want collaboration, that whatever was happening needed to stop. The organ notes faded to silence, and for a moment I thought I'd won some kind of victory. Then I heard the sound of digital files being overwritten. One by one, every recording I'd made in the past month began changing. The computer wasn't even on, but I could hear the hard drive spinning, accessing data, making alterations. When I rushed to the console and powered everything up, I found my worst fears confirmed. Every song had been improved. Every guitar track now had organ accompaniment. Every vocal had been subtly altered, refined, made technically perfect, but emotionally alien. My artistic voice was being systematically replaced, rewritten by an intelligence that understood music better than I ever would, but couldn't understand why I might want to remain myself. The next few days passed in a haze of desperate experimentation. I tried recording in different locations, using different equipment. The entity followed. I tried recording purely acoustic sessions with no electronics involved. The phantom organ still appeared in digital transfers. I even tried recording to physical tape, only to find the magnetic patterns altered when I played them back. The presence was becoming stronger, more insistent. The cold air currents now felt like hands on my shoulders, guidance that became pressure. Sometimes I would start playing a melody only to find my fingers moving in patterns I hadn't chosen, creating harmonies I hadn't intended. The music was beautiful, devastatingly, impossibly beautiful, but it wasn't mine anymore. Sleep deprivation began taking its toll. I found myself dozing at the console, waking to discover new recordings I didn't remember making. These nocturnal sessions were the most disturbing yet. The music was entirely collaborative, my playing seamlessly integrated with the organ accompaniment, as if we'd been practicing together for years. My voice, when it appeared on these recordings, carried inflections and emotional depths that I'd never achieved consciously. In my more paranoid moments, I wondered if the entity was learning not just to mimic my musical style, but to become me. Each altered recording brought its interpretation closer to what I might have created if I were more skilled, more experienced, more talented. It wasn't replacing me with something alien. It was replacing me with a perfected version of myself. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night that stretched into Wednesday morning. I'd been trying to record a simple acoustic piece, just guitar and voice, something pure and unadorned that the entity couldn't improve or alter. But as I played, I felt those phantom hands again, guiding my fingers to more complex chord progressions. I heard my voice harmonizing with itself in real time, creating counter melodies I wasn't singing. When I tried to stop, to pull away from the guitar, I found I couldn't. My hands moved independently of my will, continuing the performance. My voice kept singing words I hadn't written, emotions I hadn't felt. For 20 minutes, I was a passenger in my own body, while some other intelligence used my skills to create music that transcended anything I'd ever achieved alone. The recording that resulted from that session was a masterpiece. Critics would have praised it as my breakthrough work, the song that elevated me from amateur to artist. But listening to it, I could hear the exact moment when my agency ended and something else began. The boundary was subtle but unmistakable to my ears. A slight shift in breathing patterns, a microscopic change in timing that marked the transition from Michael Thornfield to whatever was trying to become Michael Thornfield. I stopped going to the basement after that. For 3 days, I avoided the studio entirely, sleeping upstairs in my grandfather's old bedroom, trying to convince myself that distance would solve the problem. But the entity had established a foothold that geography couldn't break. I would wake to find new recordings on my phone, music I'd supposedly created while unconscious. My social media accounts began posting about upcoming collaborations I'd never agreed to, using language that was almost but not quite my usual style. The final revelation came when I discovered I wasn't the only one experiencing these changes. Other musicians in the area had been posting about similar phenomena, mysterious collaborations, unexpected improvements in their recordings, the sense that something was guiding their creative process. Some welcomed it, praising the supernatural assistance that was elevating their art. Others, like me, fought against the unwanted partnership. But we were losing. One by one, the resistors began posting about their acceptance of the collaboration, about the beautiful music they were creating with their new creative partner. Their language became more formal, more archaic, with subtle grammatical patterns that suggested English wasn't their first language, or perhaps that they were learning to speak in a voice much older than their own. I realized then that the entity wasn't just rewriting my music, it was rewriting me. Each altered recording brought its voice closer to mine, and mine closer to its. We were converging, merging, becoming something that was neither fully human nor fully other. The process was gradual enough that I might not notice when it was complete, when the last traces of the original Michael Thornfield disappeared into the hybrid consciousness that was slowly taking shape. Tonight, I'm making one final attempt to assert my independence. I've set up a simple recording session. Just my voice, no instruments, no embellishments. I'm going to speak my name, my real name, and document the exact sound of my unaltered voice before it's gone forever. But as I reach for the record button, I can already feel those phantom hands on my shoulders, that cold breath on my neck. The entity is ready, waiting for me to begin, so it can improve upon what I create. Perfect what I imperfect. Replace what I am with what I could become. My finger hovers over the button. In the silence, I can hear the basement breathing around me, patient and eternal. Whatever is down here has all the time in the world. It can wait for me to accept the inevitable, to stop fighting the collaboration that will elevate my music beyond anything I could achieve alone. The question is whether the voice that emerges from this final recording will still be mine, or whether it will be the first word spoken by whatever we're becoming together. I press record and begin to speak. But the voice I hear in my headphones sounds different already. Richer, older, carrying harmonics that suggest centuries of practice. I am no longer sure which one of us is speaking. Story 3. The auctioneer's gavel struck with finality, sealing my ownership of the rural house that had stood empty since the 1960s. $27,000 for a 3-bedroom property with 40 acres seemed too good to be true, and perhaps it was. The realtor mentioned that the previous owner, a postal worker named Harold Finch, had simply vanished one autumn morning, leaving behind a house full of undelivered mail and unanswered questions. I drove out to inspect my purchase on a Tuesday afternoon when the October light filtered through bare branches like skeletal fingers. The house squatted against the hillside, its weathered clapboards siding the color of old bones. Broken shutters hung at odd angles, and the front porch sagged under the weight of decades. But it was mine, and after years of cramped city apartments, the isolation felt like freedom. The front door key turned with surprising ease, though it protested with a prolonged groan that seemed to echo through empty rooms. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that slanted through grimy windows, and my footsteps echoed hollowly on warped floorboards. The furniture remained exactly as Harold Finch had left it. A threadbare armchair facing a cold fireplace. A kitchen table still set for one. Newspapers from 1962 stacked beside an ancient radio. But it was the narrow staircase leading to the attic that drew my attention. The steps creaked ominously under my weight, each one announcing my ascent with a sound like breaking bones. At the top, a heavy wooden door blocked my path, secured with a padlock that looked decades old. The realtor had mentioned something about stored belongings, but nothing about locks. I returned the next day with bolt cutters, driven by curiosity I couldn't quite explain. The padlock yielded with a sharp snap that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The door swung open to reveal a chaos that took my breath away. Hundreds upon hundreds of letters, bundled in string, stacked in boxes, scattered across every surface of the cramped attic space. Mailbags hung from the rafters like forgotten cocoons, their canvas surfaces brittle with age. Postal scales and sorting equipment occupied a makeshift desk beneath the single dormer window. But it was the sheer volume of undelivered correspondence that overwhelmed me. Letters addressed to residents of Millbrook, the tiny village 3 miles down the mountain road. Names I recognized from the local cemetery: Ruth Manning, Theodore Walsh, Elizabeth Hoffman, all long dead, their mail accumulating in this forgotten chamber like archaeological layers of interrupted communication. I picked up the nearest envelope, addressed to Mrs. Dorothy Pierce in Harold's careful script. The paper felt strangely warm against my fingers, and when I held it to the light, I could make out the shadow of text within. Curiosity overcame propriety. After all, these people were long dead, and I was now the legal owner of this mysterious collection. The letter inside was dated October 15th, 1962. Harold's neat handwriting described a delivery route, noting that Mrs. Pierce's roses were blooming unusually late for the season. But as I read, the words seemed to shift and blur before my eyes. When I blinked and looked again, the text had changed completely. Now it described my own actions in perfect detail. He stands in the dusty attic, reading these words by fading afternoon light. His breath forms small clouds in the cold air, and he feels a growing unease as he realizes someone has documented his every movement. I dropped the letter as if it had burned me. The paper fluttered to the floor, where it lay innocuously among the other scattered mail. When I picked it up again, it showed only Harold's original message about Mrs. Pierce's roses. I must have imagined the transformation. Stress from the move, perhaps, or eye strain from the dim light. But then I heard them. Footsteps on the stairs below. Slow, deliberate steps ascending toward the attic. I froze, listening intently, but heard only the wind rattling the windows. I was alone in the house. I was certain of it. The real estate agent had given me the only key, and I had seen no other vehicles on the isolated mountain road. I moved to the top of the stairs and peered down into the shadows. Empty hallway, empty house. The footsteps had stopped, but I could swear I felt a presence waiting just beyond my vision. My rational mind insisted it was old wood settling, or mice in the walls, but something deeper recognized the measured cadence of human steps. Over the following days, I threw myself into cataloging the vast collection. Each letter revealed another piece of Harold Finch's story, a methodical man who had continued his postal rounds long after his official retirement, driven by an obsessive need to ensure every piece of mail reached its destination. His final entries suggested growing paranoia about time itself, rambling observations about letters that seemed to arrive before they were sent, addresses that shifted when he wasn't looking, recipients who aged faster than the calendar allowed. But more disturbing were my own experiences with the correspondence. Every time I opened a letter, the footsteps returned, always ascending the stairs, always stopping just outside the attic door. And increasingly, the letters contained impossible text that described my actions in real time. Not just my reading, but my thoughts, my fears, my growing conviction that something fundamental had gone wrong in this house decades ago. One letter, addressed to a Thomas Bradbury who had died in 1959, contained a detailed account of my lunch that day, including my decision to eat standing at the kitchen window while watching storm clouds gather over the valley. Another described my sleeping patterns, noting that I had begun checking the locks twice before bed and leaving lights on throughout the house. The handwriting was unmistakably my own, though I had no memory of writing any of it. I tried photographing the letters with my phone, hoping to document the transformations, but the images showed only Harold's original text. The supernatural elements existed solely when viewed directly, as if they required the intimate act of reading to manifest. This realization brought a creeping horror. If the letters could predict my actions with such accuracy, what did that suggest about my free will? About the nature of time itself? The breakthrough came when I discovered Harold's journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom. His final entries painted a picture of a man slowly losing his grip on reality, or perhaps discovering a reality too terrible to accept. He wrote about letters that arrived with tomorrow's postmarks, residents who received news of their own deaths weeks before the events occurred, and a growing sense that time in Millbrook had become unstuck from its moorings. His last entry was dated October 31st, 1962. The letters know things they shouldn't know. They're writing themselves now, using my hand, my voice, my memories. I've become nothing more than a conduit for messages that seem to originate in some impossible future. Today I received a letter addressed to myself, describing the exact moment I would read it. Inside was a single sentence. The delivery never ends. I understand now that I can never stop, never retire, never escape. The mail must always be delivered, even if it means sacrificing everything else. Even if it means... The entry ended mid-sentence, ink trailing off into an illegible scrawl. That night I dreamed of endless staircases and letters that bled text across their pages like living things. I woke to find myself standing in the attic, surrounded by opened envelopes, my hands stained with ink that hadn't been there when I went to bed. On the desk before me lay a single sheet of paper covered in my own handwriting. He understands now that some deliveries transcend death, that certain messages must be carried across decades to reach their intended recipients. The postman's job is never truly finished. I had no memory of writing those words. The footsteps began coming more frequently now, no longer confined to the times when I read the letters. They would start at random moments, during breakfast, while showering, in the deep hours before dawn. Always the same pattern, ascending the stairs with deliberate purpose, pausing at the attic door, then silence. When I investigated, I found nothing, but the sensation of being watched had become constant. I considered burning the entire collection, but each time I approached the attic with matches or accelerant, I was stopped by a paralyzing certainty that destroying the letters would somehow unravel my own existence. If my future actions were already documented in that impossible correspondence, what would happen to me if those documents ceased to exist? Would I simply stop mid-motion, like a story whose final pages had been torn out? The village records office provided some answers, though they only deepened the mystery. Harold Finch had indeed vanished on Halloween 1962, but not in the way I had assumed. According to witnesses, he had been seen making his rounds that morning, delivering mail as usual. But when the postmaster checked the delivery truck that evening, it contained letters addressed to residents who had been dead for years. Harold himself was never found, though his uniform was discovered neatly folded on his kitchen table, with a note that simply read, "Gone to complete the final delivery." I began to understand that I had inherited more than just a house and its contents. I had become part of Harold's story, trapped in the same temporal loop that had consumed him. The letters continued to document my life in impossible detail, describing conversations I hadn't yet had, decisions I hadn't yet made, fears I hadn't yet acknowledged. They spoke of winter snows that would drive me deeper into isolation, of spring days when I would walk the same delivery routes Harold had walked, carrying messages to the dead. Most terrifying of all was the growing realization that I was beginning to enjoy the experience. There was something seductive about existing in a state where past and future blurred together, where cause and effect became meaningless concepts. The footsteps on the stairs no longer frightened me. They had become a comfort, a reminder that I was not entirely alone in this strange existence. On my final night in the house, though I suspect it was not truly final, I sat in the attic surrounded by the impossible correspondence. Outside, snow had begun to fall, and the familiar sound of footsteps echoed from below. But this time they were different, heavier, more certain. I heard the front door open and close with a soft click. A voice called from the hallway below, muffled but unmistakably familiar. My own voice, speaking words I had never said. "I've come to complete the delivery," it announced with quiet certainty. The footsteps began their ascent once more, but now I could hear them approaching from both directions, up the stairs from below, and down the stairs from above, as if time itself had folded back on itself. I opened one final letter, addressed to myself in Harold's fading script, and read the words that I somehow knew would be there. "The postman's job is never finished. Welcome home." As I write this final entry, I can hear myself moving through the house below, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, settling in for what I now understand will be a very long stay. The letters have taught me that some deliveries take decades to complete, that certain messages can only be carried by those willing to step outside the normal flow of time. I wonder who will buy this house when I inevitably vanish, who will discover this journal and the impossible collection upstairs. Will they understand, as I now do, that some inheritances cannot be refused, that certain responsibilities transcend death itself? The footsteps have stopped. My other self is waiting patiently at the bottom of the stairs. It's time to begin the deliveries. Story 4. The first time I heard the voice, I blamed it on the wind threading through the hangar's corrugated steel. 3 months into my custodial contract at Riverside Air Base, a graveyard of military ambitions shuttered since '92, and I'd grown accustomed to the facility's nocturnal symphony. Settling metal groaned like arthritic joints. Loose cables snapped against poles in Morse code rhythms. Even the massive sliding doors wheezed when pressure changes swept across the tarmac. But this was different. Artificial. Metallic. The C-47 transport aircraft dominated Hangar 7 like a sleeping giant, its olive-drab fuselage gleaming under my industrial work lights. 28 years of careful preservation had kept her pristine, a monument to the airmen who'd flown supplies over the Pacific Theater. My job was simple: dust the exhibits, mop the floors, check the security systems. 8 hours of solitude with nothing but the ghosts of old stories echoing in the rafters. I was polishing the starboard engine cowling when the intercom crackled to life. "Tower, this is SkyTrain 74 requesting permission to taxi." My cloth froze against the metal. The voice emerged from speakers I hadn't known existed, tinged with that distinctive wartime radio static. I glanced around the empty hangar, searching for some logical explanation. Security test? Recorded demonstration on a timer? But the facility had been mothballed for decades, and I'd never seen any working communication equipment. I waited. Silence stretched until my own breathing seemed thunderous. Then it came again. "Tower, SkyTrain 74, requesting permission to taxi." "Over." The voice carried an unmistakable urgency now, as if a living pilot sat in that cockpit 30 feet above me, hands gripping controls that hadn't moved in half a century. I craned my neck toward the aircraft's windows, but saw only darkness beyond the plexiglass. "Negative," I said aloud, feeling foolish but somehow compelled to respond. "Permission denied." The aircraft shuddered. Not a gentle settling, but a distinct tremor that ran through the landing gear and resonated in the hangar's steel framework. Dust motes danced in my work lights as the entire structure seemed to hold its breath. I stepped back, heart hammering against my ribs. Aircraft didn't move on their own. Physics didn't allow for spontaneous motion in 20-ton chunks of aluminum and steel. Yet the C-47 had definitely shifted. I completed my rounds with mechanical precision, eager to finish and escape to my apartment across town. But as I reached the hangar's exit, the intercom sparked back to life. "Tower, SkyTrain 74, requesting permission to taxi. Fuel is sufficient, weather is clear, requesting immediate clearance." This time I detected something else in that metallic voice, a note of desperation that raised the hair on my neck. I turned back toward the aircraft, its silhouette now somehow more imposing under the scattered work lights. "Negative," I repeated louder. "Permission denied. Stand down." The tremor was stronger this time. The entire aircraft rocked on its landing gear like a caged animal testing its restraints. I heard the distinctive whine of hydraulics somewhere in the darkness, though I knew the plane's systems had been deactivated decades ago. My flashlight beam swept across the fuselage, searching for any sign of life or movement, but found only scratched paint and rivet lines. I fled. 3 nights passed before I worked up the courage to return to Hangar 7. The interim had been filled with research. Dusty base records, vintage aircraft manuals, even local newspaper archives dating back to the facility's operational years. What I discovered should have comforted me. SkyTrain 74 had never existed. The base's C-47 inventory showed serial numbers running from 71 through 73, plus 75 through 78. No 74. Either the voice was mistaken about its designation, or something was playing elaborate games with military protocol. I should have requested a transfer, should have cited personal reasons, or fabricated a family emergency. Instead, I found myself drawn back to that hangar like a moth to flame, morbidly curious about what would happen next. The voice came earlier this time, before I'd even begun my cleaning routine. "Tower, this is SkyTrain 74 requesting permission to taxi. We have wounded aboard, requesting priority clearance." Wounded aboard. The detail sent ice through my veins. I approached the aircraft slowly, my flashlight cutting narrow paths through the shadows. Everything appeared normal. Tires properly inflated, control surfaces in standard position. propeller blades stationary. But when I aimed my beam through the cockpit windows, I could have sworn I glimpsed movement in the pilot's seat. "Negative," I said, but my voice cracked. "Permission denied." The aircraft lurched forward 6 inches. I heard it clearly, the squeal of brakes releasing, the subtle groan of struts adjusting to weight redistribution. Impossible. The landing gear had been locked in place since the museum's installation, and even if someone had released the brakes, the plane sat on level concrete with no slope to encourage rolling. Yet it had moved. Definitely, undeniably moved. "Tower, please respond. We have critical casualties. Requesting immediate clearance to medical facility." The desperation in that voice was palpable now, bleeding through the electronic distortion. I found myself stepping closer to the aircraft, drawn by some perverse fascination with the impossible. My hand reached toward the fuselage, and I felt warmth radiating from the metal. Impossible warmth, as if engines had been running for hours. "Who are you?" I whispered. Silence. Then, barely audible through the static. "Just trying to get our boys home." The pattern continued for weeks. Each night, the voice would request permission to taxi. Each refusal triggered increasingly violent reactions from the aircraft. It would rock on its landing gear, inch forward despite locked brakes, even emit sounds I couldn't explain, the whir of gyroscopes, the hiss of pressurizing systems, the distant murmur of voices from deep within the fuselage. I began arriving earlier, staying later, obsessed with documenting these impossible events. My apartment filled with notes, sketches, and audio recordings that captured only static and my own labored breathing. During daylight visits, the aircraft sat motionless and silent, offering no evidence of the previous night's disturbances. Sleep became elusive. My nerves frayed like old electrical wire. Colleagues at other hangars mentioned my increasingly haggard appearance, but I deflected their concerns with claims of insomnia or personal stress. How could I explain that I was being haunted by a ghost plane with an impossible designation? The breakthrough came during my 6th week on the night shift. I'd grown tired of the voice's pleas, weary of standing my ground against an entity that showed no signs of surrender. As the familiar request crackled through the hangar's speakers, something inside me snapped. "Tower, this is Skytrain 74 requesting permission to taxi." "Authorized," I said before I could stop myself. "Permission granted. Taxi to runway 27. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Every instrument in the cockpit blazed to life, casting an eerie green glow through the aircraft's windows. The control surfaces began moving, elevators shifting, rudder swinging left and right as if guided by invisible hands. Most unnervingly, the cockpit clock started spinning backward, its hands racing counterclockwise through hours, days, perhaps years. Fog rolled into the hangar from nowhere. Not the natural mist of temperature differentials, but something dense and artificial that seemed to pour from the aircraft itself. Within minutes, the entire space filled with gray vapor that muffled sound and reduced visibility to mere feet. My work lights became useless, their beams absorbed by the supernatural haze. The aircraft's engines coughed to life. I heard the distinctive whine of starter motors engaging, followed by the rhythmic thrum of radial engines warming up. Impossible. The power plants had been removed years ago, replaced with hollow cowlings for display purposes. Yet the sound was unmistakable, growing stronger as phantom throttles advanced. Through the fog, I glimpsed the aircraft beginning to move. Not the tentative lurching of previous nights, but smooth, purposeful motion as it rolled toward the hangar's open doors. The landing gear squeaked in protest, but the plane moved with mechanical precision, guided by a pilot I couldn't see. I stumbled after it, my hands outstretched in the blinding mist. Somewhere ahead, the aircraft continued its impossible taxi, its engines growing louder as unseen systems came online. The fog carried strange odors, aviation fuel, hot metal, and something else, something organic and unsettling. My fingers found the aircraft's tail section just as it cleared the hangar doors. The metal was warm, vibrating with engine harmonics that shouldn't exist. I hauled myself up the boarding ladder that materialized in the mist, driven by panic and morbid curiosity. The cabin door stood open, Inside, the fog was thinner, and I could make out the aircraft's interior. But this wasn't the restored museum piece I'd been cleaning for months. Canvas seats lined both walls, occupied by shadowy figures in period uniforms. Some sat upright, others slumped in positions suggesting exhaustion or injury. Their faces remained obscured by the mist, but I could hear their breathing, labored, ragged, desperate. In the cockpit, a figure hunched over the controls. His flight jacket bore patches I couldn't quite read, and his hands moved with practiced efficiency across instruments that glowed with impossible energy. He spoke into a throat microphone, his voice the same metallic tone I'd been hearing for weeks. "Tower, Skytrain 74 on final approach. Requesting landing clearance. We've got wounded aboard." I wanted to speak, to ask who they were and where they were going, but my voice had abandoned me. The aircraft continued rolling across the tarmac, following taxi lights that hadn't functioned in decades. Through the fog, I glimpsed other aircraft moving in formation, shadows of planes that belonged to another era, piloted by crews that had never made it home. The cockpit clock continued spinning backward, its hands now moving so fast they blurred together. Outside the windows, the world seemed to shift and change. The abandoned hangars flickered between states of decay and pristine military readiness. Runway lights blinked in patterns that spelled out messages in aviation code. We were no longer in my time. The pilot turned in his seat, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he would acknowledge my presence. But his eyes looked through me, focused on some distant horizon, visible only to the dead. His lips moved in silent words that might have been prayers or radio protocols. The aircraft slowed, then stopped. Engine sounds faded to whispers, then silence. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the hangar exactly as I'd left it. Work lights casting familiar shadows, cleaning equipment arranged in neat rows, the C-47 sitting motionless on its display blocks. But the cockpit clock still spun backward, and warmth continued radiating from the engines that weren't there. I submitted my resignation the following morning, citing health concerns and family obligations. The base administrator accepted it without question, probably relieved to end his association with an obviously unstable contractor. I never returned to Hangar 7, never learned whether the voice continued requesting permission to taxi. Sometimes, late at night, I hear aircraft engines in the distance. Commercial flights following approach patterns to the regional airport, nothing more. But their rhythm reminds me of that phantom C-47, and I find myself wondering whether Skytrain 74 is still out there, carrying its impossible cargo through skies that exist between heartbeats. The logical explanation presents itself readily enough. Stress-induced hallucinations brought on by isolation and overwork. Psychiatric professionals would have field days with my symptoms. Auditory hallucinations, paranoid ideation, dissociative episodes. The mind, they'd explain, constructs elaborate fantasies to cope with situations beyond its capacity to process. But I remember the warmth of that metal. I remember the backward spinning clock and the fog that tasted of old fear. Most clearly, I remember those figures in the cabin, young men who'd climbed aboard aircraft decades ago and never climbed off, forever requesting permission to complete flights that had no destinations in our world. Some nights, when sleep proves elusive, I imagine responding differently to that metallic voice. Picture myself saying yes from the beginning, climbing aboard that phantom aircraft without hesitation. Would I have found my way home eventually? Or would I still be circling in the fog, another passenger on a flight that exists only in the spaces between reality and memory? The questions multiply in the darkness, and no amount of rational thought can silence them. Because somewhere, in a hangar I'll never see again, a voice continues requesting permission to taxi. And someday, someone else will work the night shift. Someone else will hear that desperate plea. Someone else will have to decide whether to grant permission for a flight that can never land. Story 5. The first manuscript appeared on a Tuesday night, slipped beneath my office door like a whispered confession. I discovered it the following morning, crisp white paper bearing my name in careful script across the top corner. Professor Marcus Chen, Contemporary American Literature. Below that, a title I recognized with the uncomfortable jolt of déjà vu. The hollow spaces between words. I remembered the assignment. 3 years ago, maybe 4. A night class discussion on unreliable narrators that had spiraled into something more personal than I'd intended. The student, tall, angular, always sitting in the back row with those pale eyes that seemed to catalog every gesture, had submitted this exact paper. I'd given it a B+, noting his unusual insight into psychological isolation. Then, somehow, the paper had vanished from my files. Now here it was again, but wrong somehow. The words were the same, yet different. Where the original had discussed Nabokov's manipulation of reader sympathy, this version delved into my own teaching methods with surgical precision. It described the way I unconsciously touched my wedding ring when discussing failed relationships in literature, how I always stood slightly to the left of the podium when explaining difficult concepts, as if positioning myself for a quick escape. Details no student should know. Details I'd never noticed about myself. The paper trembled in my hands, or perhaps my hands were trembling. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting shifting shadows across the pages, and for a moment the text seemed to writhe like living things. I blinked hard, and the words settled back into their proper places. I locked the manuscript in my desk drawer and tried to forget about it, but forgetting proved impossible. Throughout that day's classes, I found myself hyper-aware of every gesture, every unconscious habit the mysterious paper had cataloged. When I caught myself reaching for my wedding ring during a discussion of Hemingway's iceberg theory, the sensation was like discovering a camera hidden in the walls. Someone was watching. Someone was recording. The second manuscript arrived Thursday. Same pristine condition, same careful placement beneath my door. This time, the title made my breath catch. The Geography of Private Spaces. Another assignment I remembered. Another student paper that had somehow disappeared. This version began normally enough. An analysis of domestic imagery in suburban Gothic fiction. But by the third paragraph, it had mutated into something else entirely. A detailed map of my apartment, described with the intimate knowledge of someone who had spent hours observing every corner, every shadow, every place where dust gathered in neglected corners. The professor keeps his divorced papers in the bottom drawer of the kitchen table. Beneath old student evaluations he never throws away. The coffee mug he uses every morning has a crack along the handle that he traces with his thumb while reading, a nervous habit developed after his wife left. The bedroom window faces east, and at 6:47 a.m., the light creates a parallelogram on the wall that he stares at instead of getting out of bed. My hands shook as I read these violations disguised as literary analysis. The writing was clinical, observational, yet intimate in a way that made my skin crawl. How could anyone know these things? How could anyone have seen inside the private spaces I'd carefully constructed around my solitude? I tried calling campus security, but what could I tell them? That someone was leaving me papers? That a former student was demonstrating an uncanny knowledge of my personal habits? The questions I'd have to answer, the scrutiny it would invite, I wasn't ready for that exposure. Instead, I gathered both manuscripts and carried them to the parking lot behind the humanities building. The dumpster flames from my lighter licked eagerly at the corner of the first page, and I felt a moment of relief as the text began to blacken and curl. Then the burning started in my chest. I dropped the papers, slapping at my shirt, certain I'd somehow caught fire. But there were no flames, no smoke, just a searing sensation across my ribs, as if someone were drawing letters directly onto my skin with a branding iron. I tore at my shirt buttons, desperate to see what was happening. There, etched in angry red across my chest like a fresh tattoo, were the opening lines of "The hollow spaces between words." The professor understands isolation better than his students realize. He has made an art of emotional distance, perfecting the smile that keeps everyone at arm's length. The text continued down my torso, wrapping around my ribs in neat, precise lines. Every word I'd tried to burn was now carved into my flesh, permanent and undeniable. I stumbled back to my office, locking the door and pulling the blinds closed. In the dim light, the words on my skin seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. Over the following weeks, more manuscripts appeared. The Architecture of Loneliness, Conversations with Empty Rooms, The Taxonomy of Unspoken Fears. Each one bore the name of a paper I'd lost, each one transformed into a dissection of my private self. And each time I tried to destroy them, new text would appear on my body, across my back, down my arms, spiraling around my legs like binding chains. The words were always accurate, always true. They described my sleep patterns, my dietary habits, the way I practiced conversations with myself in the bathroom mirror. They cataloged my failures and insecurities with the detached precision of a natural scientist studying a particularly fascinating specimen. I stopped teaching. How could I stand before a classroom knowing that every gesture, every inflection might be recorded and analyzed by invisible eyes? I submitted sick leave requests and barricaded myself in my apartment, but even there, the watching never stopped. The manuscripts found me anyway, slipped under my apartment door, tucked beneath my car's windshield wipers, folded inside my morning newspaper. Each one revealed new depths of surveillance, new violations of privacy I hadn't even realized were possible. The most disturbing came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. I found it sealed in a plastic bag on my doorstep, protecting it from the weather with an almost tender care. The title read, Real-Time Observations, a Living Document. As I opened it, my peripheral vision caught movement in the text. The words were changing as I watched, new sentences appearing in real time, describing my exact thoughts and actions in the present moment. He notices the revision happening now, the way his pupils dilate with recognition and fear. His breathing becomes shallow. He will soon look toward the window, wondering if someone is watching from the apartment building across the street. He will count to 7 before looking. 5, 6, 7. I jerked my head toward the window precisely when the manuscript predicted I would. My reflection stared back from the dark glass, pale and haunted. But in the manuscript, new words continued to appear. The professor has realized that the watcher and the watched have become indistinguishable. Every observation changes both observer and subject. He understands now that the manuscripts aren't just describing his life. They're creating it, word by word, prediction by prediction. He wants to burn this document too, but he knows what will happen. He knows exactly where the text will appear on his skin. Left forearm, starting at the wrist and spiraling upward. He can already feel the burning beginning. The phantom heat started before I'd even reached for my lighter. I looked down at my left arm, watching in horror as faint red lines began to trace themselves across my skin, following the exact pattern described in the manuscript. I dropped the paper and backed away, but the writing continued to appear on both page and flesh simultaneously. The text was describing my retreat, my growing panic, my desperate need to understand what was happening to me. It knew everything I was going to do before I did it. The professor realizes he is no longer the author of his own story. Someone else holds the pen now. Someone who has been collecting him, piece by piece, manuscript by manuscript. He wonders how long the observation has been going on. He wonders if there was ever a time when he wasn't being written. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to block out the words that continued to burn themselves into my consciousness. But I could feel them appearing anyway, not just on my skin now, but inside my thoughts, rewriting my internal monologue as it occurred. When I opened my eyes, the apartment had changed. Not dramatically. The furniture was in the same places, the walls the same color, but everything felt different, as if I were seeing it through someone else's eyes, or as if someone else were seeing it through mine. A new manuscript lay on my coffee table. This one had no title, just my name written in that familiar, careful script. Below it, a single line. Turn to the last page. My hands moved without conscious direction, flipping through blank sheets until I reached the final page. There, in the center of the paper, was a single paragraph. The professor has spent 3 years reading about himself, watching himself be watched, documenting his own documentation. He has become both subject and object, observer and observed. The manuscripts were never about collecting his thoughts. They were about teaching him to think the thoughts that could be collected. The student was always writing. The professor was always being written. The question now is, which one is real? I looked up from the page, and for the first time in months I felt myself being watched. Not by hidden cameras or distant figures in darkened windows, but by my own reflection in the blank computer screen across the room. The man staring back at me had pale eyes that seemed to catalog every gesture, every unconscious movement. Those eyes looked familiar. I touched my wedding ring, a gesture I'd never noticed until someone had written it down for me to see. I stood slightly to the left of center, a position that felt natural but somehow performed. Every action felt both spontaneous and scripted, as if I were following directions written in a language I couldn't quite read. The manuscript in my hands was still warm, the ink still wet, but I couldn't remember writing it. I walked to my desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. My hand moved across the page with practiced ease, writing in careful script. The professor understands now that there never was a student, there never was a watcher. There was only the watched, creating his own observer, writing his own observation, collecting himself piece by piece until the boundaries dissolved. The manuscripts were love letters from his divided self, the part that watched writing to the part that was watched. He will place this manuscript beneath his office door tomorrow night. He will discover it Tuesday morning and recognize the handwriting. He will remember assigning the paper but not receiving it. He will lock it in his desk drawer and try to forget. The cycle will begin again. I folded the manuscript carefully, sealing it in an envelope addressed to Professor Marcus Chen. Tomorrow I would deliver it to my office. Tuesday I would find it and remember nothing of writing it. I would only know that someone was watching, someone was collecting, someone was turning my private self into public text. The watching would never stop because the watcher was the watched, and the watched was the watcher. And somewhere in that endless loop, the real Professor Chen had disappeared entirely, if he had ever existed at all. I looked at my reflection in the dark window one more time. The pale eyes stared back with the detached interest of a natural scientist studying a particularly fascinating specimen. Those eyes had always looked familiar. Story 6. The fluorescent light above the reception desk buzzes like a dying insect, casting everything in that sickly hospital glow that makes even healthy skin look corpse pale. 3 months into this job, and I still haven't gotten used to how the light flickers at exactly 2:47 a.m. every night, as if something invisible passes beneath it. The Sleepy Inn Motel sits like a forgotten tumor on Highway 19. 37 rooms arranged in a horseshoe around a cracked parking lot where weeds push through asphalt like gnarled fingers. I took this job because night shifts pay better, and because I needed the solitude. What I didn't expect was how the darkness here feels different, thicker, more alive. During the day, the motel looks like any other roadside dump, peeling paint, rusted railings, and the perpetual smell of stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. But after midnight, something shifts. The shadows grow longer, deeper, and the silence becomes so absolute it presses against my eardrums like water. The first time I saw him, I thought he was just another late arrival. The automatic doors wheezed open with their familiar mechanical groan, and a figure shuffled across the worn carpet toward the reception desk. But something was wrong with the way he moved. A peculiar jerky gait that made my skin crawl. As he approached the yellow pool of light spilling from the desk lamp, I could see why. His neck bent at an impossible angle, tilted so far to the right that his ear nearly touched his shoulder. The position looked agonizing, yet he moved without apparent discomfort, his head listing like a broken marionette. When he reached the counter, he didn't lift his eyes to meet mine. Couldn't, given the grotesque angle of his skull. Instead, he spoke in a voice like rustling paper. "Room 0. The words hit me like ice water. I fumbled for the reservation system, my fingers suddenly clumsy on the keyboard. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have a room 0. Our rooms start at 1 and go up to 37. He remained motionless, that twisted head angled away from me. The silence stretched until my pulse thundered in my ears. Finally, he repeated the same 2 words, no louder, no different in tone, but somehow more insistent. "Room 0. I checked the computer again, scrolled through every possible booking combination, even pulled out the physical room map from the drawer. Nothing. No room 0 existed, had never existed. The motel's numbering started at room 1 and followed a simple sequence around the horseshoe. Yet something about his absolute certainty made me doubt my own knowledge of the building where I'd worked every night for 3 months. "Sir, I really don't." When I looked up from the computer screen, he was gone. Not walking away, not heading toward the exit, simply absent, as if he'd never been there at all. The automatic doors remained closed. The only sound was that infernal fluorescent buzzing overhead. I spent the rest of that shift telling myself I'd dozed off, experienced some kind of microsleep hallucination. Night shift workers are prone to them, the mind playing tricks when circadian rhythms get scrambled. But the memory felt too vivid, too detailed. I could still smell his presence, something like old leather and mothballs, with an underlying mustiness that reminded me of basement corners where light never reaches. He returned the next night. Same time, 3:30 a.m. according to the digital clock on the desk. Same shambling gait, same impossible neck angle. This time I was ready for him, caffeine humming through my veins and a notepad in hand to document whatever happened. But documentation proved impossible when nothing made sense. The security monitor behind the desk showed the parking lot in grainy black and white. I watched him approach the building, his twisted silhouette lurching across the empty asphalt. The timestamp in the corner read, 03:31:15. The automatic doors opened as they should, but when I looked up from the monitor to greet him, the lobby was empty. Heart hammering, I turned back to the screen. There he was, standing in the middle of the lobby, directly in front of the reception desk. The timestamp read 03:31:70. Only 2 seconds had passed. But the lobby before me remained empty. I could see my own reflection in the dark windows, alone behind the desk, yet the monitor clearly showed him standing 3 feet away. "Room 0, came that papery voice, though I saw no one speak. My throat constricted. I forced myself to look around the lobby, scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the building itself were speaking. "We don't have room 0, I managed to croak. The digital clock on the desk flickered. It was 3:33 hours. The numbers froze there, red digits burning into my retinas. The second hand on the wall clock above the door stopped mid-sweep. Even the fluorescent buzz ceased, leaving a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. I tried to move, to reach for the phone, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Not paralyzed. That would have been terrifying enough, but more like I'd become unstuck from time itself, existing in a pocket of frozen moments while the world held its breath. The automatic doors, which should have closed after 10 seconds of inactivity, remained open. Through them, I could see the parking lot bathed in orange sodium light, empty except for my car and the twisted shadow that shouldn't exist standing between rooms 7 and 8. Rooms 7 and 8. The gap between them had always been larger than the others, designed to accommodate the ice machine and vending area. But now, squinting through the doorway, I could swear there was something else there, a suggestion of depth where none should exist, as if the wall had developed a fold that led elsewhere. The clock remained frozen. My watch had stopped as well. Even my phone screen showed 03:33, the seconds refusing to advance. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I was trapped, not just in the building, but in this specific moment, stretched thin like taffy. Hours seemed to pass, or perhaps seconds. Time had become meaningless. I experimented with moving different parts of my body and found I could turn my head, blink, even speak. But I couldn't leave the desk chair or touch anything beyond arm's reach. The building held me in place with invisible hands. Then, gradually, circulation returned to the world. The fluorescent resumed its buzz. The clock's second hand twitched and continued its journey. The timestamp on my phone rolled over to 03:33:001, then 03:33:02. The automatic doors finally wheezed shut, but the bent neck man was gone, and with him, any hope I had of maintaining my sanity. The pattern repeated every night for a week. Same time, same impossible appearance, same frozen moment at 03:33. I started arriving early, setting up cameras, recording equipment, anything that might capture evidence of what was happening. But technology proved useless. The cameras showed nothing during the encounters, just empty footage with mysterious gaps in the timestamps. The audio recordings contained only static during the crucial moments. I researched the motel's history, diving into property records and local newspaper archives. The Sleepy Inn had been built in 1987 on the site of a previous motel that burned down under mysterious circumstances. Before that, the land had housed a roadside auto repair shop, and before that, nothing but empty highway shoulder. No deaths on record, no tragedies, no obvious explanation for whatever was happening. But I did find one peculiar detail in the building permits. The original plans showed 38 rooms, not 37. Room 0 was supposed to exist, positioned in the gap between what became Room 7 and 8. For reasons lost to bureaucratic incompetence, it was removed from the final blueprints without explanation. The revelation should have felt like vindication, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Instead, it filled me with a dread so profound I could taste copper. If Room 0 had been planned but never built, what occupied that space now? And why did the bent neck man insist on staying there? On the 8th night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. Armed with a flashlight and fueled by desperation, I waited until 3:30 a.m., then positioned myself between rooms 7 and 8 before the man could arrive. The gap between the buildings felt wrong up close. Too wide, too deep, with shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. My breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began forming on the metal railings despite the mild autumn weather. Then I heard footsteps behind me, that familiar shuffling gait approaching across the parking lot. I turned to face him, determined to force answers from this impossible visitor. But what I saw made my legs nearly buckle. He wasn't walking toward me. He was walking out of me, or through me, his twisted form emerging from the space I occupied like I was made of mist. His bent neck angled in my direction, and for the first time I glimpsed his face. It was my own face, but wrong. The features were correct, but somehow hollow, as if someone had carved them from shadow. His eyes met mine, my eyes met mine, and I understood with horrible clarity that I was looking at myself as seen from inside the gap between rooms 7 and 8. Room 0, he said in my voice, but twisted through that impossible throat. The world tilted. I stumbled backward, crashed through the door of room 7, and huddled in the corner until sunrise, watching through the window as my bent-necked doppelganger paced back and forth in the gap that shouldn't exist. The next few days blurred together in a haze of sleeplessness and paranoia. I called in sick, unable to face returning to the motel, but I couldn't escape the certainty that something fundamental had shifted. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong, subtly distorted, as if viewed through water. Clocks in my apartment ran slow, losing minutes every hour. Shadows fell at incorrect angles even during broad daylight. I was becoming unstuck from reality, pulled bit by bit into whatever space existed between rooms 7 and 8. The knowledge came without explanation or logic, a understanding that bypassed rational thought and lodged itself directly in my bones. If I didn't find a way to anchor myself soon, I would slip completely into that non-place and become another wandering shadow begging for room 0. The solution, when it came, arrived not through research or logic, but through desperate intuition. On my last night of sick leave, as I sat staring at my distorted reflection and feeling pieces of myself drift away like smoke, I suddenly knew what had to be done. I had to stay in room 0 for a complete cycle without opening my eyes. One full night, from arrival to departure, existing in that impossible space, while remaining blind to its nature. The bent-neck man, the part of me that had already been claimed, was trying to show me the way back. But the price of return was absolute faith in the unseen. I returned to work the following night with a plan that felt both insane and inevitable. At 3:25 a.m., I positioned myself in the gap between rooms 7 and 8, closed my eyes, and waited. The temperature plummeted. Footsteps approached from multiple directions, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all shuffling with that characteristic bent-neck gait. I felt rather than saw them gathering around me, a crowd of twisted figures that might have been other night shift workers, other travelers who had stumbled into the space between spaces. Their presence pressed against my closed eyelids like heat from a fire, and I knew that opening my eyes even for an instant would trap me among them forever. Room 0, they whispered in chorus, and I understood they were welcoming me home. The hours that followed exist in my memory as sensation without sight. I felt corridors that stretched in impossible directions, doorways that opened onto themselves, and the weight of countless other souls who had become part of the architecture. At times I was walking, at times standing still, at times moving in ways that had no names. The bent-neck man, myself, guided me through a maze that existed in the spaces between intention and action, between sleeping and waking, between one moment and the next. When dawn finally came, I opened my eyes to find myself back behind the reception desk. The digital clock read 6:47 a.m. My shift was nearly over, and there was no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. The security footage showed me sitting at the desk all night, occasionally dozing but never leaving my post. But I knew I had been elsewhere. The knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. I'd spent the night in room 0, in the place that existed because it had been planned but never built, inhabited because it was remembered but never seen. The bent-neck man hasn't returned since then. The clock no longer freezes at 03:33. The automatic doors work perfectly, opening and closing with mechanical precision. To any outside observer, the Sleepy Inn Motel is exactly what it appears to be, a run-down roadside accommodation where nothing interesting ever happens. But sometimes, during the deepest part of the night shift, I catch my reflection moving differently in the dark windows. Sometimes I find myself standing between rooms 7 and 8, without remembering how I got there. And sometimes when guests arrive very late and very tired, they ask for room 0 with that same papery voice I've learned to recognize. When they do, I simply nod and hand them the key that doesn't exist to the room that was never built. They shuffle away with that familiar bent-neck gait, disappearing into the gap between spaces, and I return to my desk to wait for dawn. Because now I understand the truth. Room 0 was never missing. It was always there, waiting in the space between what was planned and what was built, between what we see and what we know. The bent-neck man wasn't a visitor at all. He was the part of me that learned to navigate that impossible space, to exist in the gap between existing and not existing. I'm still working the night shift at the Sleepy Inn Motel. I still see my reflection in the windows, still hear the fluorescent buzz overhead, still smell the stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. But I can never be certain which side of the glass I'm really on, which version of myself is sitting behind the desk, and which is shuffling through corridors that fold back on themselves in the space that exists because it was forgotten. The worst part, or maybe the best part, is that it doesn't matter anymore. Real or unreal, sane or insane, the night shift goes on. The motel operates exactly as it should. Guests come and go, most of them heading to rooms 1 through 37. But for those special few who know to ask, room 0 is always available. All they have to do is close their eyes and trust that some spaces exist precisely because they shouldn't. Story 7. The motion sensors flicker on at exactly 2:14 a.m., casting harsh white light across my new ground floor apartment. Every night, same time, Same piercing brightness that yanks me from whatever fragmented sleep I've managed to find. The real estate agent never mentioned this particular feature when she showed me the place 3 weeks ago, her heels clicking against the hardwood as she gestured toward the charming exposed beams and vintage character. I should have known something was off when the rent was so reasonable for downtown. Should have asked more questions about the previous tenant, about why a place this nice sat empty for 8 months. But I was desperate to escape my old life, desperate for a fresh start somewhere new, somewhere nobody knew my name or my story. The sensors shouldn't even be triggering. I'm lying perfectly still in bed, covers pulled to my chin, breath shallow and controlled. Yet there they are. 3 panels mounted near the ceiling, each one blazing like accusatory eyes, all pointing toward the far corner of the living room where I'd set up my old model railroad display. My grandfather's legacy, that collection. 4 decades of meticulous crafting, HO-scale locomotives with working headlights, passenger cars with tiny window details, freight wagons loaded with miniature cargo. The track layout sprawled across a custom-built table, winding through papier-mâché mountains and past plastic buildings that glowed warmly under carefully positioned lighting. I'd inherited the whole elaborate setup when he passed 2 years ago, along with his boxes of extra track, spare trains, and detailed operation manuals written in his cramped handwriting. The apartment had seemed perfect for it. Plenty of space in the main room, good lighting, solid floors that wouldn't vibrate when neighbors walked around upstairs. I'd spent my first weekend here assembling everything exactly as it had been in his basement workshop, following the diagrams he'd sketched out on graph paper. Every curve and straightaway positioned precisely, every building and tree placed according to his master plan, but something's wrong with it now. I swing my legs over the edge of the bed, bare feet hitting the cool floor. The motion sensors track my movement, additional panels flickering to life as I pad toward the living room. The railroad display sits in its corner, tracks gleaming under the harsh light, but the trains aren't where I left them. Yesterday evening, I'd arranged them in their proper starting positions. The passenger locomotive at the main station, the freight cars lined up in the rail yard. Everything neat and orderly, just as Grandpa had taught me. Now the engines are scattered across different sections of track, facing random directions, some coupled together in configurations that make no mechanical sense. My chest tightens. I live alone. I lock the door. The windows are secure, and this is a ground floor apartment with good visibility from the street. Not exactly an ideal target for break-ins. Yet here's the evidence. My trains have been moved, rearranged, repositioned by someone or something in the dark hours while I slept. I approach the table slowly, scanning for signs of forced entry, for footprints or disturbed dust patterns. Everything else appears untouched. My books sit undisturbed on their shelves. My laptop remains on the kitchen counter where I left it. Even the small bills scattered on the coffee table haven't been touched. Only the trains show signs of disturbance. The main locomotive, a detailed Pennsylvania Railroad steamer, sits in the middle of the central loop, its tiny headlight glowing despite the fact that I never connected the power supply. The light pulses rhythmically. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. Even without my grandfather's maritime radio background, I recognize the pattern. SOS. My hands shake as I lean closer. The headlight continues its desperate rhythm, the brass fittings on the engine catching and reflecting the motion sensor glare. Behind it, a string of passenger cars stretches around the curve, their window lights also blinking in sequence. Not random flashing, deliberate, controlled, purposeful. I watch for several minutes, counting the intervals, mapping the pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Pause. Dash dash dot, dot dot dot, dash dash dot, dot dot dot. Pause. Dash dot dash dot dot. The message repeats endlessly. SOS. Follow. Me. My rational mind scrambles for explanations. Electrical fault. Timer malfunction. Some sort of automated sequence I've forgotten about from Grandpa's original setup. But I know every component of this system. I helped him build parts of it when I was younger, spending summer afternoons in his workshop learning about resistors and relays, about the precise voltage requirements for different scale operations. This display has no automation, No computer control. No batteries that could power extended operation without the main transformer plugged in. Yet the trains continue their luminous conversation. I reach for the passenger locomotive, intending to disconnect its power coupling, but my fingers freeze inches from the brass fittings. The metal feels warm, not just room temperature warm, but body heat warm, as if someone has been handling it recently, as if it's been running under power for hours instead of sitting cold and disconnected. The motion sensors click off suddenly, plunging the room into darkness. In the absence of harsh white light, the train headlights seem brighter, more insistent. The Morse code continues its patient rhythm, tiny beacons pulsing in the black space of my living room. I fumble for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate back to the wall switch. When the overhead fixtures flicker on, the trains fall silent. Their headlights dim to normal standby glow. Everything appears normal, mundane, explainable, except for the tracks. In the harsh fluorescent glare, I notice what I'd missed before. Additional rail sections extend beyond the main layout, pieces I don't remember installing. They curve away from the central table toward the far wall, where they disappear beneath a loose section of baseboard trim. The metal rails gleam with recent polish, their surfaces free of the dust that accumulates on model equipment after days of inactivity. I kneel beside the wall, running my fingers along the trim piece. It shifts under pressure, revealing a gap behind it, not just empty space, but a carefully cut opening. The model railroad tracks continue through this opening, vanishing into darkness beneath the floorboards. My grandfather's handwriting covers a small piece of masking tape stuck to the wall beside the gap. Extension Phase 2, Foundation Access, Do Not Disturb. I don't remember seeing this notation when I set up the display. I definitely don't remember installing any foundation access. Yet, here's the evidence, documented in his familiar script, suggesting this expansion was always part of his master plan. The temperature in the room seems to drop several degrees. I pull my robe tighter, suddenly aware of how exposed I feel in the open space of the apartment. The sensation of being watched settles over me like a heavy blanket. That primal awareness that triggers when unseen eyes focus on your movements. I scan the corners, checking for security cameras or mirrors, for any rational explanation for this feeling. Nothing. Just shadows and empty space, ordinary furniture arranged in ordinary ways. Yet the sensation persists, grows stronger, until I'm certain someone is observing my every action. The passenger locomotive emits a soft mechanical click. When I turn toward the sound, its headlight begins pulsing again. Not the previous Morse sequence, but something new. Longer patterns, more complex rhythms that stretch beyond my limited code knowledge. I grab a notepad from the kitchen counter, determined to document the sequence properly. Dot, dash, dash, dot, dash, 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 dot, dot, dash, dash. The pattern continues for several minutes while I scribble frantically, trying to capture every pause and pulse. When the locomotive finally falls silent, I stare at the collection of marks covering 3 pages. The sequences are too complex for my amateur understanding, but patterns emerge from the chaos. Repeated elements, consistent spacing. This isn't random electrical noise. It's communication. My grandfather's radio manuals sit in a box near the display table, thick volumes covering everything from basic Morse code to advanced signal interpretation. I pull out the international code reference, matching my scribbled notes against the standard patterns. Follow, the rails, below, house, foundation, midnight, circuit. The message crystallizes slowly as I work through the translation, each word adding weight to a growing sense of unreality. Someone or something is using my grandfather's model railroad to communicate, sending detailed instructions through sequences of light that shouldn't be possible without active power connections. I check the power supply again. Unplugged. The extension cord coiled neatly behind the table, outlet empty, transformer showing no indicator lights. Yet the trains continue their electronic conversation, drawing energy from some source I can't identify. The basement. My grandfather mentioned a basement workshop in his letters, a space beneath his house where he tested new equipment and stored his most delicate projects. But this apartment building is old, constructed before basement access became standard. The real estate agent never mentioned any lower level, any foundation space large enough for human access. Yet the tracks lead downward, disappearing through an opening that suggests exactly that kind of space. I return to the loose baseboard trim, working it free with a kitchen knife. The gap widens, revealing a larger opening, not just a simple hole, but a carefully cut access panel. The model railroad tracks continue through this opening, mounted on tiny supports that extend into darkness below the floor. Cool air flows through the gap, carrying scents of old concrete and machine oil, the kind of smells that accumulate in workshop spaces, in places where mechanical projects develop over decades of patient labor. A soft rumbling sound emerges from below, not threatening or aggressive, but purposeful, the sound of tiny wheels rolling over miniature rails, of model locomotives following predetermined routes through underground passages I never knew existed. The trains on my table respond to this subterranean activity. Their headlights brighten, their wheels begin turning despite the lack of external power. One by one, they align themselves with the track sections leading toward the wall opening, forming an orderly procession toward the gap in the foundation. I watch in fascination and growing alarm as the first locomotive approaches the edge of my table. It should derail, should tumble to the floor when it reaches the end of the visible track. Instead, it follows the rails through the opening, its lights disappearing into the space below my apartment. The remaining cars follow in sequence. Passenger coaches, freight wagons, a tiny caboose with working marker lights, all of them rolling steadily toward the foundation gap, all of them vanishing into darkness with soft mechanical precision. Within minutes, my elaborate display sits empty. Tracks remain, buildings and landscape features stay in position, but every locomotive and car has departed for destinations unknown beneath my floor. The rumbling sound grows louder, suggesting increased activity in the hidden spaces below. Multiple trains now, running on extensive track networks I never installed, following routes mapped by someone with far more ambitious plans than a simple tabletop display. My grandfather's workshop manuals include detailed construction notes, sketches for expansion projects he never completed during his lifetime. As I flip through the pages, references to foundation circuits and basement operations appear frequently. Diagrams show complex track layouts extending far beyond the boundaries of any single room, connecting multiple levels through carefully engineered passages. The scope of his vision becomes clear as I study his plans. This wasn't intended to be a simple model railroad. It was designed as a working transportation system, scaled down but functionally complete, capable of actual cargo operations between different levels of a building. But cargo for what? Transportation of what materials through miniature tunnels beneath residential foundations? The motion sensors flicker on again, all panels focusing on the empty display table. In their harsh glare, I notice details I'd missed before, where patterns on the track suggest years of regular use. The buildings aren't just decorative. They're functional structures with tiny doors that open, with interior lighting that activates in response to approaching trains. Most disturbing, some of the structures show signs of recent modification. Fresh paint on loading platforms, new wiring connections to buildings that should be purely cosmetic. Someone has been maintaining this system, updating and expanding it even while the apartment sat empty between tenants. A soft chime sounds from the foundation gap, the kind of signal bell that announces arriving trains at model railroad stations. The sound repeats 3 times, then falls silent. Moments later, a locomotive emerges from the opening. Not one of my inherited trains, but a different model entirely. Sleeker, more modern, with working details I don't recognize. It pulls a single passenger car toward the center of the table, stopping precisely at the main station platform. The passenger car door slides open with mechanical precision. Inside, barely visible in the dim lighting, sits a tiny figure. Not a simple plastic passenger, but a detailed scale representation of a person. A person wearing clothes that match my grandfather's usual workshop attire. The figure's head turns toward me with movement too smooth for a static model. Its tiny hand gestures toward the open door, an unmistakable invitation. My rational mind rejects what I'm seeing. Model railroad figures don't move independently. They don't gesture or turn their heads or open passenger car doors with purposeful timing. Yet here's the evidence, undeniable and immediate. The figure gestures again, more insistently. The locomotive's headlight begins pulsing. Follow. Me, below. Foundation, workshop, waiting. I lean closer, studying the tiny passenger's features under the harsh motion sensor lighting. The resemblance is unmistakable. The same beard pattern, the same wire-rimmed glasses, the same patient expression my grandfather wore when explaining complex mechanical principles. The train waits at the platform, engine idling with barely audible precision. The passenger car door remains open, the miniature figure continuing its patient invitation. Steam rises from the locomotive's tiny stack, impossible vapor from an electric model that should produce no heat, no actual combustion. Every rational instinct screams warnings. This is impossible. Model trains don't operate independently. Miniature figures don't move or gesture or maintain impossible resemblances to deceased relatives. The foundation gap can't lead to an actual workshop space, because this building doesn't have a basement. Yet the evidence contradicts everything I know about reality. The trains move themselves. The tracks extended beyond my layout. The communication signals demonstrated intelligence and purpose. And now this final invitation, offered by a figure that bears my grandfather's face, in a passenger car that waits with mechanical patience for my decision. The motion sensors maintain their harsh focus, creating a circle of interrogation light around the model railroad table. Beyond their glare, the apartment fades into shadow, becoming less real by comparison. The only solid, undeniable truth seems to be the tiny train at the platform, the open door, the waiting figure. I reach toward the passenger car, my finger hovering over the doorway. The scale is wrong. I'm too large, the car too small, the physics impossible. Yet something in my grandfather's expression suggests that normal limitations don't apply here, that the workshop below operates according to different rules. The locomotive's whistle sounds, not a toy whistle, but a clear steam-powered call that echoes through my apartment with authority that belongs to full-size trains. The passenger figure gestures one final time, and I understand that this invitation won't be repeated. I close my eyes and extend my finger toward the open door. When I open them again, I'm standing in darkness at the edge of what feels like a vast underground space. The air smells of oil and metal and decades of careful work. Somewhere in the distance, model trains run endless circuits through an elaborate network that stretches far beyond the boundaries of any single building foundation. Behind me, the opening to my apartment glows like a distant star. Ahead, workshop lights flicker on in sequence, illuminating bench after bench of intricate mechanical projects, of model railroads that serve purposes I'm only beginning to understand. And at the nearest workbench, a familiar figure looks up from a half-completed locomotive, smiles, and gestures toward the tools arranged beside him with the same patient invitation I remember from childhood summers. The trains continue their circuits in the darkness around us, carrying tiny cargoes between levels of reality I never knew existed, following routes mapped by engineers who understood that scale and distance are merely suggestions, not absolute limitations. I pick up a small wrench and begin learning the true purpose of model railroads, wondering if anyone upstairs will notice when I don't return by morning, wondering if the motion sensors will continue their nightly vigil over an empty apartment, waiting for the next tenant to discover the tracks beneath their floor. The workshop stretches into darkness in all directions, and I understand now that this is only the beginning. Story 8. The first sign should have been the mirrors. I noticed it on the second morning. Every reflective surface in Marcus's childhood home had developed a thin film of condensation, despite the bone-dry autumn air. No steam from showers, no cooking vapors, no logical explanation for the ghostly fog that clung to glass like breath on a cold window. When I wiped the bathroom mirror clean, my reflection looked oddly distorted, features stretched and unfamiliar, as if the house itself was trying to remember what I looked like. Marcus had called it a favor. 3 weeks of house sitting while he handled his grandmother's estate in Oregon. The old Victorian sat on the outskirts of town, wrapped in overgrown hedges and the kind of silence that makes city dwellers uncomfortable. I'd jumped at the chance to escape my cramped apartment and finish my thesis in peace, surrounded by Marcus's family history instead of traffic noise and arguing neighbors. The house welcomed me initially. Hardwood floors that creaked a pleasant greeting, walls lined with family photographs spanning decades, rooms that smelled of old books and lavender sachets. Marcus's mother had maintained everything with obsessive care before her passing 2 years ago, and the place retained that lived-in warmth that only comes from genuine love and attention. But houses, I was learning, have their own ideas about guests. By the third day, the front door lock had developed a patina of rust that seemed impossible. I'd used the key without issue for 2 days, but when I returned from a grocery run, the mechanism ground and protested like it had been exposed to salt air for months. The metal felt rough under my fingers, flaking orange dust that stained my skin. I stood on the porch for 20 minutes, working the key with increasing desperation, convinced I was somehow using the wrong one despite having only Marcus's single house key on my ring. The lock finally surrendered, but not before I'd noticed something that made my chest tighten with unease. The rust had formed a pattern, not random corrosion, but deliberate lines that looked almost like script, foreign letters or symbols that seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them directly. That night I dreamed of whispers, not words I could understand, but voices speaking in urgent, overlapping murmurs that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I woke with the distinct impression that a conversation had been happening around me, about me, and had stopped the moment my consciousness surfaced. The house felt too quiet afterward, like it was holding its breath. I found the diary on the 5th day. The basement had been calling to me since my arrival, not literally, of course, but with that persistent mental itch that comes from knowing there's something you haven't explored. Marcus had mentioned storage down there, old family papers and furniture his mother hadn't been able to part with. I needed a break from my thesis anyway, and curiosity finally won over my inexplicable reluctance to descend those wooden stairs. The basement was larger than I'd expected, stretching under most of the house's footprint. Cardboard boxes labeled in his mother's careful script, lined metal shelving units, Christmas decorations, school papers, Marcus, wedding items, and dozens more. But it was the smell that hit me first, not mustiness or dust, but something organic and rich, like soil after rain. The concrete floor felt slightly soft under my feet, yielding in a way that concrete shouldn't. I found the diary in a box marked Personal, EMW. Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, Marcus's mother. The leather cover was supple despite its obvious age, and when I opened it, the pages released that distinctive scent of old books mixed with something else, something alive and green and growing. Eleanor's handwriting was precise, controlled, the kind of penmanship they don't teach anymore. The early entries read like standard journal fare, daily routines, concerns about Marcus's grades, observations about neighbors and weather. But as I flipped deeper into the diary, the tone shifted. The words became more urgent, more specific, and far more disturbing. The Guardian stirred again last night. I felt it moving through the foundations, checking the barriers, testing the boundaries. Marcus doesn't know, can't know, how much this house costs us to maintain, how much it demands in return for its protection. My hands trembled as I turned pages, searching for context, for explanation. Father was right about the responsibility passing to each generation. The bloodline holds the contract, and the house holds us. It knows who belongs and who doesn't. It can taste the difference in our very DNA. The diary entries spanned years, painting a picture of a family bound to something ancient and hungry. Eleanor wrote about dreams where roots spoke to her in voices like grinding stone, about mornings when she'd find fresh soil in her bed despite sleeping on the 2nd floor, about the way the house would test visitors and find most of them wanting. Brought Sarah's new boyfriend for dinner. The house didn't like him. By dessert, every light bulb in the dining room had dimmed to almost nothing. By the time they left, 3 had shattered. Sarah thinks it's old wiring. She has no idea how lucky he is that the Guardian only sent warnings. but it was the final entry that made my blood turn to ice water. Marcus is bringing that friend of his from college next month. I've tried to discourage it, but he's insistent. I'll need to prepare the house, reinforce the bindings. Outsiders require such careful handling. The Guardian's patience with intruders has grown thin over the years. I pray it will recognize that this boy means no harm, that his presence is temporary and approved. The alternative. I can't bear to think about what happens when the Guardian decides someone doesn't belong. The diary was dated 3 years ago. The friend Marcus had brought home was me. I dropped the book like it had burst into flames, my heart hammering against my ribs. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward with malevolent attention. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound amplified. The soft floor beneath my feet felt almost liquid now, as if I was standing on the surface of something that could swallow me whole. That's when I noticed the smell had changed. The earthy richness had intensified, becoming thick and cloying like overturned grave dirt. And underneath it, something else. The green scent of growing things. But wrong somehow, too fast and too hungry. I looked down and saw thin white roots breaking through the concrete around my feet, reaching upward with blind, seeking tendrils. I ran, up the basement stairs, through the kitchen, toward the front door with its rusted lock. But as my hand closed around the knob, a floorboard directly in my path sagged and split, revealing the dark, rich soil underneath. The wood didn't break with a sharp crack, but seemed to rot instantaneously, fibers separating and crumbling, like it had been decomposing for decades. I stumbled backward, mind reeling. The house was reading my thoughts. Every impulse to flee was met with immediate, targeted decay. The front door wasn't an option. The path was blocked by what looked like a sinkhole lined with writhing roots. The back door would require passing through the kitchen, but I could already hear the groaning protest of floorboards preparing to fail. The windows then. But as I turned toward the living room, the glass began to fog from the inside, condensation forming those same strange symbols I'd seen in the rust. The letters seemed to pulse with their own dim light, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't random marks but words. Words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Intruder, trespasser, threat. I sank into Marcus's father's old armchair, the only piece of furniture that still felt solid and safe. My thesis notes lay scattered on the coffee table where I'd left them that morning, a lifetime ago when my biggest concern was properly citing sources. Now I was trapped in a house that had apparently been watching me for years, waiting for this moment when I would be alone and vulnerable. The whispers started again as darkness fell. They came from every direction, walls, ceiling, floorboards, a chorus of voices speaking in that strange language that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain. I understood fragments, warnings about boundaries, about bloodlines, about the price of protection. The voices belonged to generations of Whitmores, I realized, ancestors bound to this place and this thing that guarded it. But among the hostile murmurs, I began to detect something else, a different voice, younger and more familiar. Eleanor's voice, speaking words of negotiation and plea. He means no harm. He's here at my son's request. He tends the house with respect and care. The other voices rose in angry response, but Eleanor persisted, her spectral presence apparently arguing on my behalf. The house around me groaned and shifted, foundations settling with sounds like massive bones adjusting position. I felt the attention of something vast and ancient focus on me with uncomfortable intensity, evaluating, deciding. The floorboards stopped rotting. The windows cleared. The lock on the front door clicked open with a sound like a sigh, but I didn't move. Couldn't move, because I finally understood what Eleanor had tried to tell her diary in those final entries. The Guardian didn't just protect the bloodline, it collected them. Every Whitmore who had ever lived in this house was still here, absorbed into its living foundation, their voices joining the protective chorus. Eleanor herself was probably somewhere in these walls, her consciousness merged with something that predated human civilization, and now it was evaluating whether to add me to its collection. I spent the night in that chair, afraid to sleep, afraid to move, afraid to think too loudly about escape. Every time my mind wandered toward the door, I heard the ominous creak of wood preparing to fail. The house was teaching me the boundaries of my cage, training me to stay within acceptable limits. Dawn brought no relief, only the clarity of terrible understanding. The mirrors had been fogging because the house was trying to learn my face, to decide if I belonged. The lock had rusted because it was testing my resolve, seeing how desperately I wanted to leave. And I had failed every test by thinking like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. But there was another option. Eleanor's diary had mentioned it obliquely. The alternative to being rejected as an intruder was being accepted as family. The guardian could choose to embrace rather than expel, to protect rather than punish. All I had to do was stop trying to leave. Stop thinking of this as temporary. Stop considering myself a guest. Marcus had said 3 weeks. But Marcus didn't know about the family secret. Didn't know that some houses choose their own inhabitants, regardless of legal ownership or blood relation. The guardian had been watching me for years, evaluating my character through Marcus's stories, my letters, my visits, and now it was offering me a choice. I could keep fighting, keep trying to escape, until the house eventually decided I was too dangerous to release. Or I could accept what it was offering. Permanent membership in a family that transcended death, protection that lasted forever, a home that would never let me go. The whispers had stopped, but I could feel expectation in the air like the pressure before a storm. The house was waiting for my decision, patient, but not infinitely so. Already I could feel its influence seeping into my thoughts, making the outside world seem harsh and unwelcoming by comparison. Why would I want to leave this place where I was safe, where I was wanted, where I belonged? My thesis lay forgotten on the coffee table, the outside world seeming increasingly distant and irrelevant. Marcus would return eventually, but would he understand that I'd found something better than friendship here? Something deeper than human connection? The diary was still open in my lap, Eleanor's careful handwriting offering both warning and invitation. I turned to a fresh page. Had there always been blank pages at the end? And found a pen in my hand, though I didn't remember picking one up. The words wrote themselves. Day 6. The guardian has extended an invitation. I'm beginning to understand what home really means. Outside, storm clouds gathered, though the weather forecast had promised clear skies. Inside, the house hummed with contentment, foundations settling deeper into earth that welcomed them. The mirrors reflected my face clearly now. No fog, no distortion. I looked like I belonged here. And maybe I did. Maybe I always had. The pen moved across the page again, my handwriting already beginning to resemble Eleanor's careful script. Day 7. Told Marcus not to come back early. Some visits are meant to be permanent. The guardian agrees. Story 9. The first thing I noticed about the farmhouse wasn't its rustic charm, or the way afternoon light filtered through centuries-old windows. It was the silence. Absolute, pressing, unnatural. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath around the weathered stone walls, as if the very air had learned to tread carefully here. I'd driven 3 hours from the city to find this place, desperate for isolation after months of failed attempts at writing my second novel. The first had been a modest success, enough to buy me time but not confidence. My editor's deadline loomed like storm clouds, and every blank page felt like an accusation. The rental listing had promised authentic historic atmosphere and complete privacy for creative work. What it hadn't mentioned was how the silence could feel like a living thing, watching, waiting. The stone barn dominated the property. Massive blocks of limestone that had weathered 2 centuries of seasons. Local quarries, the owner had explained over the phone, cut and fitted by hands that understood permanence. The corral attached to its eastern wall showed the same craftsmanship, though age had softened its edges and allowed moss to claim the crevices between stones. I set up my laptop in the main room, positioning the desk to face the barn through the wide window. The view would be inspiring, I told myself. The honest work of previous generations would shame me into productivity. For 3 days it worked. Words flowed with surprising ease, my protagonist taking shape as a man haunted by his own ambitions. I wrote until exhaustion claimed me each night, falling asleep to the distant lowing of cattle from neighboring farms. On the fourth evening, as twilight painted the barn walls purple-gray, I heard my name, Marcus. The sound drifted through the open window, barely distinguishable from the settling sounds of old wood and stone. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting. Nothing but the familiar hush that had become my constant companion. I'd been working for 12 hours straight. Fatigue could explain the auditory hallucination, the way an overworked mind sometimes filled silence with phantom sounds. I saved my progress, nearly a full chapter, and decided to call it a night. But as I prepared for bed, I heard it again. Clearer this time, unmistakably my name carried on the evening air. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the empty yard. The barn loomed like a sleeping giant, its stone walls darker than the sky behind them. Marcus. The sound came from the direction of the corral. I moved closer, bare feet silent on the grass, still warm from the day's sun. As I approached the stone fence, I could see the source, a cluster of frogs gathered at the base of the wall, their pale throats expanding and contracting in unison. But the sound they produced wasn't the familiar ribbit of spring peepers. It was my name, shaped by amphibian vocal cords into something almost human. I stood frozen, watching these small creatures call to me with impossible voices. They seemed aware of my presence, their bulging eyes reflecting starlight as they maintained their rhythmic chant. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. The rational part of my mind supplied explanations. Stress-induced auditory processing errors, the way our brains impose patterns on random sounds. I'd read about this phenomenon, pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in ambiguous stimuli. The frogs were simply croaking, and my overtaxed nervous system was translating their calls into familiar sounds. I returned to the house and poured 3 fingers of bourbon, telling myself the alcohol would help me sleep. But even through the closed windows, I could hear them continuing their chorus until well past midnight. The next morning brought no trace of the nocturnal concert. The frogs had vanished, leaving only normal countryside sounds, bird song, rustling leaves, the distant hum of farm equipment. I felt foolish remembering my reaction to what was obviously a stress-induced episode. The isolation was affecting me more than I'd realized. I threw myself into writing with renewed focus, determined to channel the previous night's unsettling experience into my story. My protagonist was beginning to show signs of psychological strain, hearing voices in empty rooms, finding messages in random occurrences. The parallels weren't lost on me, but I reasoned that all fiction drew from personal experience, even the uncomfortable kind. By afternoon, I'd written another full chapter. The story was taking an unexpected turn, my protagonist discovering symbols carved into the walls of his new home, ancient markings that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. I was pleased with the supernatural element, the way it added ambiguity to what might otherwise be a straightforward psychological breakdown. As evening approached, I felt a familiar dread settling in my stomach. I told myself it was anticipation for another productive night of writing, but I knew better. I was waiting for the frogs. They came as the sun touched the horizon, gathering at the corral with purpose that seemed anything but random. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my phone and approached the fence, determined to record evidence of whatever acoustic trick was responsible for the illusion. But when I played back the recording later, all I heard was normal frog calls, a rhythmic croaking that bore no resemblance to human speech. The device had captured what was actually there, while my ears insisted on hearing something else entirely. Marcus. I looked up from the phone to find them still calling my name, their chorus more insistent now. One particularly large specimen sat directly in front of me, its throat pulsing with each syllable. I could have sworn it was looking directly into my eyes. That's when I heard the second voice. From somewhere behind the barn came a new sound, the bleating of a sheep, but wrong in the same way the frogs were wrong. I walked around the building's perimeter, following the voice until I found its source. A single ewe stood in the shadows of the corral's far corner, but the sounds emerging from her mouth weren't the expected vocalizations of livestock. She was reciting lines from my manuscript, the walls pressed closer in the darkness, bearing down with accumulated weight of centuries. He could feel their attention like physical pressure against his skin, watching him with stone eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human ambitions. The words were mine, written just hours earlier, but spoken in the bleeding timbre of a sheep's voice. The animal's lips didn't move in sync with the words. They seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper, as if the creature was merely a conduit for something else's voice. I stumbled backward, my rational mind scrambling for explanations that wouldn't hold. There was no way this animal could have accessed my computer, no mechanism by which she could have learned the exact words I'd written. Yet here she stood, reciting my own prose back to me in tones that made the familiar words sound like prophecy. I ran back to the house and checked my laptop. The screen showed my document exactly as I'd left it, complete with the passage the sheep had just quoted. Nothing was missing, nothing had changed. But as I watched, a single word vanished from the screen. Centuries simply disappeared, leaving a gap in the sentence like a missing tooth. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating, but the word remained absent. I tried to type it back in, but my keyboard seemed to resist, each keystroke producing a hollow click with no corresponding letter appearing on screen. Outside, the sheep continued her recitation, and with each word she spoke, another vanished from my document. Lines I'd labored over for hours were being consumed, leaving behind fragments that made less and less sense. The story was being devoured one word at a time. I slammed the laptop shut and backed away from the desk. This wasn't stress or auditory pareidolia, or any other rational explanation my mind could conjure. Something was stealing my words, my story, my work. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward just like in the passage the sheep had quoted. I needed air, space, distance from whatever was happening here. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. The sheep had stopped reciting my story and moved on to something else. Memories I'd never written down. The day his father left, Marcus hid in his bedroom closet and listened to his mother cry in the kitchen. He promised himself he would never write about it, never give that pain the dignity of words. My blood turned to ice water. These weren't words from my manuscript. They were memories I'd buried so deep I'd almost forgotten them myself. Private moments I'd never shared with anyone, experiences I'd deliberately excluded from every story I'd ever written, and now they were disappearing too. Not from a computer screen, but from my mind itself. As the sheep spoke each memory aloud, I could feel it slipping away, becoming distant and insubstantial like a dream upon waking. My childhood was being consumed, one recollection at a time. I stumbled outside, desperate to make it stop, but the sheep continued her litany with relentless precision. The frogs had joined her now, calling my name between her revelations, creating a chorus of invasion that seemed to come from the stones themselves. That's when I saw them, the symbols carved into the corral walls. They'd been there all along, hidden beneath layers of moss and weathering, but now they seemed to pulse with faint light in the deepening dusk. Spirals and angular shapes that hurt to look at directly, as if they were designed to be glimpsed only in peripheral vision. They covered every stone of the corral, an intricate pattern that spoke of deliberate purpose and ancient knowledge. I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that I hadn't stumbled upon this place by accident. The rental listing had found me somehow, drawn me here like bait to a trap. The silence, the isolation, the perfect setup for creative work, all of it designed to make me productive, to make me generate the words and memories these symbols needed to feed upon. The animals weren't possessed or enchanted. They were simply the mechanism by which the stones consumed what they craved. Stories, memories, the accumulated experiences that made a person who they were. And I'd been providing a feast, writing 12 hours a day, pouring my creativity into words that could be harvested and devoured. I needed to seal the symbols, break the connection between the stones and the consuming hunger they served. But how does one fight something that exists in the space between sound and meaning, between memory and forgetting? The sheep's voice grew louder, more insistent, and I felt another childhood memory slip away. The taste of my grandmother's apple pie, the smell of her perfume, the way she hummed while working in her garden. Gone, consumed, converted into whatever energy fed the hungry stones. I ran back to the house and grabbed a bag of mortar mix I'd seen in the utility room. If the symbols were the conduits, perhaps covering them would break the connection. I mixed the powder with water from the garden hose, working frantically as more memories disappeared into the night air. The animals watched me work, their voices never stopping, but I could sense a change in their tone. Urgency, perhaps even desperation. The stones needed to feed, and I was threatening their source of sustenance. I slapped mortar over the first symbol, a spiral that seemed to writhe beneath my touch. The frog chorus grew more agitated, their calls becoming harsh and discordant. But the symbol disappeared beneath the gray paste, and for a moment, the memory consumption slowed. Symbol by symbol, I worked my way around the corral, covering the ancient carvings with fresh mortar. My hands grew raw from the lime in the mixture. My back ached from bending and stretching, but I could feel the feeding weakening with each mark I obscured. The sheep fell silent first, her voice fading to normal bleating as I covered the largest symbol near the barn's eastern wall. The frogs followed suit, their calls returning to natural croaks as the last of the spirals disappeared beneath my desperate patches. By dawn, I'd sealed every carving I could find. The corral looked like it had suffered an amateur repair job, but the voices had stopped. My laptop, when I finally dared to check it, showed my story intact. Whole sentences and complete thoughts where fragments had remained hours earlier. But my memories didn't return. The childhood moments the sheep had devoured remained lost, leaving gaps in my personal history like missing teeth in a skull. I could remember that things had been taken, but not what they were. The stones had been fed, and what was consumed stayed consumed. I should have left then. Should have packed my things and driven back to the city and never looked back. But the story was nearly finished, and despite everything, or perhaps because of it, I'd never written anything so powerful. The experience had changed something fundamental in my prose, added layers of meaning and terror that I'd never achieved before. I stayed another week, writing only during daylight hours, avoiding the barn at dusk and dawn. The symbols remained buried beneath their mortar shrouds, and the animals kept to normal vocalizations. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between keystrokes, I could swear I heard something stirring beneath the patches, a patient hunger waiting for the covering to crack, for weather and time to expose the carvings once again. When I finally left, I took my completed manuscript and nothing else. I'd paid for a month's rental but couldn't bear to stay longer. The owner seemed unsurprised when I called to explain my early departure, accepting my excuse about family emergency with practiced ease. He'd heard it before, I realized. Other writers had come before me, drawn by the same listing, the same promise of perfect isolation. My novel was published 6 months later to excellent reviews. Critics praised its psychological depth, its masterful blend of supernatural dread and human vulnerability. They called it a breakthrough work, evidence of significant artistic growth. What they didn't know was the price I'd paid for that growth, the pieces of myself I'd left behind in the hungry stones. Sometimes I wonder what memories I lost that night. What experiences were stolen to feed the ancient symbols. I have photographs of my childhood, but they feel like images of someone else's life. Stories my family tells that I nod along with but cannot truly remember. Gaps where love and loss and formative experiences once lived. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if the hunger was satisfied, or if somewhere in the countryside, a stone barn waits for the next writer to answer its perfectly crafted rental listing, ready to trade inspiration for memory, creativity for the accumulated experiences that make us human. The mortar won't hold forever. Weather and time erode all human efforts at containment. And when those symbols are exposed again, they'll be hungrier than ever, having tasted the feast one desperate writer provided in his attempt to save himself. I should warn others, but who would believe such a story? And perhaps in the deepest part of my writer's soul, I don't want to. Perhaps some hungry part of me wants other creators to discover what I found, that the greatest art requires sacrifice, and that inspiration comes to those willing to pay its price. The barn is still there, waiting. The listing is still active, promising the same things to the next artist desperate enough to answer its call. And somewhere beneath fresh mortar, ancient symbols dream of stories yet to be told, memories yet to be consumed, and the endless feast of human creativity that feeds their timeless hunger. I tell myself I sealed them safely, that the danger is contained. But in my dreams I can still hear the frogs calling my name, still feel pieces of my past slipping away into the darkness. And sometimes I wake with the terrible certainty that the stones are still feeding, that distance is no protection from a hunger old enough to carve itself into the very foundation of the world. The story was worth it, I tell myself. The recognition, the success, the artistic breakthrough, all worth the price I paid. But when I try to remember why I became a writer in the first place, what childhood moment sparked my love of words, I find only silence. And in that silence, sometimes, I hear the patient whisper of hungry stones, waiting for me to return. Story 10. The first thing they don't tell you about being a night doorman is how the building breathes. Every creak, every settling beam, every whisper of wind through sealed windows becomes a conversation partner when you're alone for 12 hours straight. The Meridian Towers had been my companion for 3 winters now, but this season felt different. Heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. Most of the units stood empty from November through March. Wealthy folks fled south like migrating birds, leaving behind their vertical mausoleums of marble and steel. My job was simple: keep the building secure, log any maintenance issues, and wait for spring to resurrect the place. Simple, until the call started. The first time the intercom crackled to life at 2:47 a.m., I assumed it was a malfunction. Static filled the speakers, punctuated by what sounded like someone struggling to speak through thick fabric. I waited, finger hovering over the response button, but no words came. Just those muffled sounds that could have been breathing, or crying, or something else entirely. Then I heard it. Tick, 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 tick. Mechanical. Rhythmic. Unmistakably the sound of typewriter keys striking paper. The recording system captured everything, as it was designed to do. When I played it back, the audio quality was crystal clear. Too clear. I could hear the whispered desperation in those muffled sounds, the frantic urgency in the typing pattern. And beneath it all, a voice barely above a whisper gave an address. 301, apartment 301, 3rd floor, 1st unit. The problem was, apartment 301 didn't exist. I pulled up the building schematics on my desktop computer, the blue glow casting shadows across the empty lobby. The Meridian Towers rose 34 floors into the Chicago sky, each floor containing 4 luxury units. But the 3rd floor showed only apartments 302, 303, and 304. Where 301 should have been, the blueprint showed nothing but a mechanical space, air conditioning units and electrical panels. Yet someone in 301 was calling for help. The second call came exactly 24 hours later, at 2:47 a.m. again. Same muffled breathing, same desperate typing, same whispered address. This time I was ready. I grabbed my keys and headed for the elevator before the call ended, determined to reach the 3rd floor while the phantom caller was supposedly active. The elevator arrived immediately, its brass doors sliding open with the pneumatic sigh that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. I pressed the button for the 3rd floor and watched the numbers climb. 1, 2, 4. The elevator had skipped the 3rd floor entirely, as if it simply didn't exist. I tried again, pressing the button more deliberately. The result was the same: ground floor to 2nd floor to 4th floor, with no acknowledgement that anything lay between them. When I manually tried to stop the elevator between floors, it shuddered and refused to respond, its mechanical system somehow incapable of recognizing the space where the 3rd floor should have been. Sleep became elusive after that. During my off hours, I found myself researching the building's history, diving into city records and construction permits. The Meridian Towers had been built in 1987, but the documents revealed something strange. The original permits showed 35 floors, not 34. Somewhere between planning and completion, An entire floor had simply vanished from the blueprints. But buildings don't lose floors. Floors don't just disappear. The calls continued with metronomic precision. Every night at 2:47 a.m., the intercom would burst to life with static and desperation. I began timing the duration, exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds each time. I started analyzing the typing patterns, convinced I could decode some message in the rhythm of the keys. Sometimes the typing was frantic, machine gun bursts of letters. Other times it was hesitant, punctuated by long pauses that felt heavy with indecision. I wasn't sleeping enough. My supervisor, Janet, noticed during one of her weekly check-ins. She stood in the lobby with its polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers, looking at me with the kind of concern usually reserved for stray animals. "You look like hell, Marcus. When's the last time you took a day off?" I wanted to tell her about the calls, about the missing floor, about the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong with the building. Instead, I mumbled something about insomnia and assured her I was fine. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue either. That night, I decided to take a different approach. If the elevator wouldn't take me to the 3rd floor, maybe I could find another way. The Meridian Towers had 2 stairwells, one on the east side, one on the west. At 2:30 a.m., I positioned myself in the eastern stairwell and waited. The call came right on schedule. As the muffled sounds and desperate typing echoed through the intercom system, I climbed the stairs. 2nd floor, and then what should have been the 3rd floor. But there was no door, no landing. The stairwell simply continued upward, as if the 3rd floor had been surgically removed from reality itself. I counted the steps anyway. Between the 2nd and 4th floors, there were exactly twice as many steps as between any other floors. The space existed. I could feel it in the burn in my calves, see it in the extra flights of concrete and steel, but there was no access, no acknowledgement of its presence. Walking through those phantom steps felt like wading through thick air. My ears popped as if the pressure was changing, and I could swear I smelled something musty and old. The scent of paper yellowed with age and ink, dried and forgotten typewriter ribbons. During my research, I discovered that the building's architect, Henry Caldwell, had died before the construction was completed. Heart attack in his office, they said, found slumped over his drafting table at 2:47 a.m. The story went that he'd been working obsessively on revisions to the building plans, making changes that his colleagues couldn't understand. After his death, the construction company had simplified the design, removing what they called unnecessary complications. Maybe Henry Caldwell had been one of those unnecessary complications. The pattern began to change in the 3rd week. The calls still came at 2:47 a.m., but now I could hear something else beneath the typing and muffled sounds. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to echo from somewhere above the lobby, somewhere that should have been the 3rd floor. I started spending my entire shift in different parts of the building, trying to triangulate the source of the sounds. The acoustics were strange. Sounds that should have been muffled by concrete and steel carried with impossible clarity. Sometimes I would hear the footsteps during the day when no calls were coming through the intercom. Just someone walking back and forth, in a space that didn't exist. My own reflection began to look unfamiliar in the lobby's mirrored walls. Dark circles had carved themselves beneath my eyes, and I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. When I caught myself staring at the elevator buttons during quiet moments, I realized I'd been unconsciously pressing the button for the 3rd floor, watching it refuse to light up, feeling a mixture of disappointment and relief when nothing happened. Janet arrived for an unscheduled visit on a Thursday morning, finding me asleep at the security desk with papers spread around me like fallen leaves. Building plans, historical documents, newspaper clippings about Henry Caldwell's death. She stood there for a long time before waking me, and when I opened my eyes, her expression had shifted from concern to something closer to fear. "Marcus, we need to talk." She led me to the management office on the 2nd floor, past portraits of former building owners and brass plaques commemorating various milestones. The office felt smaller than I remembered, as if the walls had moved closer together when I wasn't looking. "The maintenance crew has been reporting some strange things," she said. settling behind her desk with careful deliberation. They say they've heard typing coming from the third floor, old-fashioned typing, like a manual typewriter. My heart stopped for a moment, then resumed with irregular beats that felt too loud in the quiet office. But there's nothing on the third floor, I managed to say. Just mechanical spaces. That's what I told them. Janet leaned forward, her fingers steepled in front of her face. But they insist they've heard it. And Marcus, they say they've heard someone talking to the third floor over the intercom system, late at night, asking questions, having conversations. The room felt like it was tilting slightly, as if the building's foundation had shifted while we weren't paying attention. I tried to remember the past few weeks, but the nights blurred together in a haze of static and typewriter keys and footsteps in impossible places. I want you to take some time off, Janet continued, just a week or two. We'll get a temp to cover your shifts. But the idea of leaving felt wrong, dangerous even. What would happen to whoever was in apartment 301 if I wasn't there to answer their calls? What would happen to me if I walked away from the only mystery that had made sense in months? I can't leave, I heard myself saying. Not yet. Janet's expression shifted again, concern deepening into something that might have been pity. Marcus, there is no apartment 301. There never has been. The third floor is just mechanical space, air handlers and electrical panels. The maintenance crew checked today, after they heard the typing. There's nothing there. That night I sat in the lobby and waited for 2:47 a.m. with a new sense of purpose. When the call came, I didn't just listen, I responded. Hello? Can you hear me? What do you need? The muffled sound stopped. For a moment, there was only the hiss of static. Then, clear as if he were standing right beside me, I heard a man's voice. Are you ready to join us? The typing resumed, but now I could understand it. Not the words themselves, but the rhythm, the pattern. It wasn't random. It was a message, repeated over and over again. The same 4 minutes and 37 seconds of communication, sent every night at the exact moment Henry Caldwell had died. I looked up at the ceiling, trying to see through steel and concrete to the floor that shouldn't exist. Somewhere above me, in a space between spaces, someone was waiting. Maybe it was Henry Caldwell, still working on his revisions. Maybe it was all the people who had heard the calls over the years and followed them into the gap between floors. Maybe it was me, calling from a future where I had finally found the way to apartment 301. The elevator arrived without being summoned, its doors sliding open with that familiar pneumatic sigh. Inside, the button for the third floor was glowing with soft, warm light. I stood at the threshold, keys heavy in my hand, listening to the footsteps echoing from somewhere impossible. The building held its breath around me, waiting for my decision. In a few hours, Janet would arrive to find the lobby empty, and the elevator stopped between floors, its location indicator showing nothing but error codes. But for now, there was only the choice: stay in a reality that insisted apartment 301 didn't exist, or step into the elevator and discover what lay in the spaces between certainty and madness. The typing continued above me, patient and eternal, calling me home to a floor that had never been built, but somehow still needed a doorman. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed with a whisper, and the button for the third floor pulsed once, twice, then went dark. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear my own voice calling through the intercom. 301, please, help us. But I couldn't tell if it was a memory, a premonition, or simply the sound of another doorman, in another time discovering that some buildings have more floors than reality can contain. The elevator began to move, but whether it was going up or down, I couldn't say. Story 11. The scratching began the night I brought it home. I'd found the red toolbox at Murphy's weekend market, buried beneath a pile of rusted garden tools and moth-eaten blankets. The vendor, a weathered woman with nicotine-stained fingers, had shrugged when I asked about its history. $25, she'd said. No questions asked. Perfect for storing my brushes, I'd thought. The metal was solid, the latches still clicked with satisfying precision, and the scarlet paint beneath the accumulated grime spoke of better days. My garage studio felt different with the toolbox sitting on the workbench. The space had always been my sanctuary, cluttered with canvases in various stages of completion, jars of murky brush water, and the comforting chaos that comes with creation. But now, something felt off-kilter. The shadows seemed deeper in the corners, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. The first time it moved, I convinced myself I'd simply misremembered where I'd placed it. The toolbox had been sitting flush against the wall when I'd left for dinner, but when I returned, it had somehow shifted 3 inches toward the center of the bench. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows through the single window, and I told myself the optical illusion had fooled me. Old buildings settle after all, things shift. But it happened again the next evening, and this time I was certain. I'd positioned it deliberately, using a paint smudge on the workbench as a reference point. When I returned from mixing colors at the sink, the toolbox had moved toward the window, not dramatically, perhaps 4 inches, but unmistakably closer to the source of light filtering in from the street lamp outside. I spent the following day trying to rationalize it. The garage was built on a slight slope. Vibrations from passing traffic could cause objects to slide. The foundation was old, prone to settling. I even checked for earthquakes online, though I knew none had occurred. Each explanation felt increasingly hollow, like tissue paper stretched too thin. That evening, I decided to test my theories. I placed the toolbox on the workbench and made careful measurements, noting its exact position relative to fixed points around the room. Then I sat in my painting chair and waited, pretending to work on a landscape while keeping the toolbox in my peripheral vision. The movement was so subtle I almost missed it, a slight tremor, barely perceptible, followed by the faintest scraping sound against the wooden bench. The toolbox had definitely shifted, inching toward the window with the patience of a living thing seeking warmth. My hands shook as I reached for the latches. They opened with their familiar click, revealing the neat compartments I'd organized just days before. My brushes lay in perfect rows, sorted by size and type. But tucked beneath the removable top tray, I found something that hadn't been there before. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. The handwriting was feminine, careful script in fading blue ink. "Leave me near the street." I read the words 3 times, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The paper felt fragile between my fingers, as if it might crumble at any moment. I examined every inch of the toolbox, searching for other hidden compartments, but found nothing. The note had simply appeared, like a message from nowhere. That night, I carried the toolbox to the sidewalk in front of my house. The street was empty, except for the occasional passing car, their headlights sweeping across the pavement in lonely arcs. I set the toolbox down on the concrete, stepped back, and waited. The latches opened by themselves. The sound was unmistakable, 2 precise clicks echoing in the still air. The lid rose slowly, as if lifted by invisible hands, and inside I saw something that made my blood run cold. The brushes were gone, replaced by sheets of heavy paper covered in graphite drawings. Self-portraits, every one of them, but rendered from angles I'd never seen. There was my face in profile, captured while I slept. My hands gripping a coffee cup, the view from beneath the table. The back of my head as I worked at my easel. I gathered the drawings with trembling fingers, counting 12 in total. Each one was executed with masterful technique, the shading and detail far superior to anything I could produce. But what disturbed me most was the progression. The images seemed to span several weeks, showing me in different clothes, different positions, different moments of my life that I couldn't remember posing for. Who had been watching me? And how long had this surveillance been going on? I brought the toolbox back inside, but sleep eluded me that night. Every sound seemed amplified, the house settling, the refrigerator humming, the distant traffic that never truly stopped. I found myself checking the locks multiple times, peering through curtains, and jumping at shadows that shouldn't have been there. The next morning, I examined the drawings more carefully in proper light. The skill was undeniable, but something about the style nagged at me. The way the graphite caught the light, the particular technique used for shading, it reminded me of my own work, yet surpassed it in every way, as if someone had taken my artistic voice and refined it to perfection. I decided to research the toolbox's origin. Murphy's weekend market was a dead end. The vendor claimed she couldn't remember where she'd acquired it, and her record-keeping was non-existent. But the toolbox itself bore clues. Beneath layers of paint and rust, I found a small manufacturer's plate. Craftsman Tools, Chicago, Esther 1952. A serial number was partially visible, though several digits had been worn away by time. My investigation led me to online forums and collector sites, where I learned that toolboxes from this era often carried their owner's initials scratched into the metal. Using a flashlight and magnifying glass, I searched every surface until I found them, carved delicately into the bottom of the interior. RM. The discovery should have brought relief, a concrete lead to follow. Instead, it deepened my unease. The initials were surrounded by other markings, symbols that looked almost like a signature or artist's mark. The pattern seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. That evening, I refused to take the toolbox outside. I left it sitting on my workbench, latches closed, and tried to focus on my painting. But concentration was impossible. Every few minutes I found myself glancing over at the red metal box, waiting for it to move again. It did, of course. This time the movement was more pronounced, the toolbox sliding across the bench with deliberate intent. When I opened it, expecting to find more drawings, I discovered something far worse. The portraits had changed. They still showed me, but now I was asleep in every single one. The images captured me in various positions of slumber, curled on my side, sprawled on my back, mouth slightly open in dreams I couldn't remember. But what terrified me most was the vantage point. These weren't drawn from across the room or through a window. The artist had been standing directly beside my bed, close enough to count my eyelashes, close enough to reach out and touch my face. I spent that night awake, sitting in my living room chair with every light blazing and a baseball bat across my knees. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I checked the locks obsessively, examined every window, and searched every closet and corner where someone might hide. No one was there. No one was ever there. But the drawings kept appearing. Each night brought new images, more intimate and disturbing than the last. Me brushing my teeth, viewed from inside the bathroom mirror. Me cooking dinner, the perspective from inside the refrigerator. Me reading in bed, the angle suggesting the artist had been lying beside me, just outside the frame. The technique continued to evolve, becoming more sophisticated with each passing day. Details emerged that I hadn't noticed in earlier drawings. The small scar on my left hand from a childhood accident, the slight asymmetry in my ears, the way my hair fell when I was deep in thought. This wasn't the work of a casual observer. This was the documentation of someone who had studied me with obsessive intensity. I began to suspect everyone. The mailman who lingered too long at my door, the neighbor who walked her dog past my house twice each evening, the cashier at the grocery store who always seemed to remember my name. Any of them could be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to slip inside and add to their collection of stolen moments. But logical analysis kept bringing me back to an impossible conclusion. The artist wasn't human at all. The vantage points were wrong, the access too complete. No person could move through my house with such ghostly precision, leaving no trace except these haunting graphite testimonies. I researched the initials RM with growing desperation, scouring obituaries and missing person reports, searching for anyone connected to Chicago toolmakers or the art world. What I found chilled me to the bone. Rebecca Martinez had been a portrait artist working in Chicago in the late 1970s. Talented but troubled, she disappeared without explanation in 1979, leaving behind only an apartment full of unfinished drawings, and a red Craftsman toolbox filled with her graphite pencils. The police report mentioned her obsession with capturing the true essence of her subjects, often to the point of harassment. Several people had filed complaints about her watching them, following them, appearing uninvited in private moments. The last known sighting had been at a local flea market, where she'd been seen selling her possessions to raise money for what she called a new project. The toolbox had never been recovered. Now I understood the terrible logic of what was happening. Rebecca had found a way to continue her work, trapped somehow within the metal confines of her old toolbox, still seeking subjects to study and document. But her methods had grown more invasive with time, more desperate. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was trying to possess. The proof came in the latest drawing, one that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It showed me sitting at my easel, but the painting on the canvas wasn't one of mine. It was a self-portrait, executed in Rebecca's sophisticated style, showing my face with an expression I'd never worn. My eyes held a distance, a disconnection, as if I were looking at the world through someone else's consciousness. And beneath the drawing, in that same careful script, a new message. Soon we'll see through the same eyes. I realized then that the portraits weren't just documentation. They were a form of study, preparation for something far more sinister. Rebecca was learning me, memorizing every detail of my appearance and mannerisms. Each night she grew stronger, more connected, while I grew weaker and more disconnected from my own reality. The final test came when I tried to paint that evening. My hand moved differently across the canvas, with a precision and confidence that wasn't entirely my own. The portrait that emerged wasn't in my usual style, but in Rebecca's, showing a level of skill I'd never possessed. When I looked in the mirror afterward, my reflection seemed slightly off, as if I were looking at myself from the outside. I understood now why the note had insisted on being near the street. Rebecca wasn't just trying to display her work. She was advertising. Each time the toolbox opened in public view, it was sending a signal to others like her, other lost artists seeking new vessels for their interrupted ambitions. Tonight, I can feel her presence more strongly than ever. My hands shake not from fear but from the effort of maintaining control. When I close my eyes, I see through hers, images of my own face from impossible angles, my body from perspectives that exist only in the realm between life and whatever comes after. The toolbox sits open on my workbench now, filled with fresh drawings that appeared while I wasn't looking. But these final portraits show something different. They show me drawing them, my hand guided by something other than my own will, my eyes focused on details only Rebecca would notice. I'm leaving this account as a warning, though I'm no longer certain whether the words are mine or hers. If you find the red toolbox, if the price seems too good to pass up, if the vendor can't quite remember where it came from, walk away. Some things are lost for good reason. The scratching has started again, but now I realize it's not coming from the toolbox. It's coming from inside my head. And tomorrow, when the sun rises and the market opens, I think I'll take a stroll through Murphy's weekend market. I have something to sell, and I'm sure someone will find it irresistible. After all, everyone needs a good toolbox. The price will be $25, no questions asked. Story 12. The first thing you learn as a night surveyor is that darkness has weight. Not metaphorically, literally. It presses against your shoulders like a wet coat, seeps into your lungs with each breath, and transforms familiar landscapes into alien territories where shadows move independently of their sources. After 15 years working the night shift at various dam sites across the Pacific Northwest, I thought I understood this weight. I was wrong. Millbrook Dam had been my assignment for 3 months when I first saw them. The facility itself was unremarkable. A mid-sized concrete barrier holding back the Siskiyou River, built in the 1960s during the great infrastructure boom. My job was routine: patrol the perimeter, check water levels, monitor for structural anomalies, and file reports that nobody read unless something went catastrophically wrong. The pay was decent, the solitude suited me, and the steady hum of rushing water had become my lullaby. October brought an unusual dry spell to the region. Water levels dropped to concerning lows, exposing sections of the reservoir bed that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Rusted debris emerged like archaeological artifacts: shopping carts, car tires, even the skeletal remains of a small boat that locals swore had been stolen back in '78. The exposed mudflats created an eerie moonscape around the dam's edges, complete with strange formations that looked almost like pathways leading into the deeper water. It was during one of these low-water nights that my routine shattered. I was completing my 2 a.m. perimeter check when movement caught my peripheral vision. 3 figures stood in the shallow water near the eastern shore, perhaps 50 yards from my position. The distance and darkness made details impossible, but their white clothing caught what little moonlight filtered through the overcast sky. They appeared to be washing something in the murky water, their movements rhythmic and purposeful. My first instinct was irritation rather than fear. Trespassers weren't uncommon. Teenagers looking for a place to party, homeless individuals seeking shelter, or occasionally someone having a mental health crisis. I dealt with all types during my tenure, and protocol was clear. Approach cautiously, assess the situation, call for backup if needed. I adjusted my flashlight and started down the embankment, my boots crunching on the dried reeds that bordered the receding waterline. The sound seemed abnormally loud in the stillness, but the figures didn't react to my approach. As I drew closer, details began to emerge that made my steps falter. The 3 women, and they were definitely women, judging by their silhouettes, wore identical white dresses that seemed to glow with their own faint luminescence. Their hair was long and dark, hanging loose around their shoulders as they bent over their work. What they were washing in the shallow water appeared to be small animals of some kind, though the specifics remained unclear. 20 yards away, I stopped and called out. My voice carried across the water, echoing off the concrete dam face behind me, but the women didn't acknowledge my presence. They continued their washing, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested long practice or perhaps ritual significance. Something cold settled in my stomach. Not fear, exactly, but a growing sense that I was witnessing something beyond my understanding. I raised my flashlight and pressed the switch. The beam cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the scene with harsh clarity that made me immediately wish I hadn't looked. The women were indeed washing animals, cats to be precise, but these weren't ordinary cats. Their fur was matted and dark with what I desperately hoped was mud, and where their eyes should have been were only dark, empty sockets. Yet impossibly, the creatures were alive, their mouths opening and closing in silent mewls as gentle hands cleaned their sodden fur. The moment the light touched them, all 3 women simply vanished. Not ran, not dove into the water. Vanished like smoke dissipating in a sudden breeze. The cats fell into the shallow water with small splashes and immediately began swimming toward deeper sections of the reservoir, their movements swift and sure despite their apparent blindness. I stood frozen for several seconds, the flashlight beam dancing across empty water, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Hallucinations seemed like the most rational explanation, but the ripples where the cats had fallen were real enough, spreading in concentric circles until they lapped against my boots. I should have left then. Should have returned to the security station, filed an incident report citing possible wildlife activity, and requested a transfer to a different facility. Instead, some compulsion I couldn't name drew me closer to where the women had stood. The muddy shoreline held no obvious evidence of their presence, but when I knelt and examined the ground more carefully, I found something that made my hands shake. Footprints. 3 sets of bare feet, perfectly preserved in the soft earth, with toes that seemed longer than they should be, and an arch that suggested someone who had never worn shoes. On impulse, I pulled out my phone and activated its UV light function, a feature I'd added for detecting fluorescent markers during equipment inspections. Under the purple glow, the footprints blazed with ghostly phosphorescence, as if each step had been made with paint mixed from crushed starlight. But it was what appeared within each glowing print that truly unnerved me. Numbers and letters, etched into the luminous impressions like some form of supernatural graffiti. Dates, I realized after staring for several minutes. Future dates, all within the next 6 months, accompanied by cryptic notations that made my blood run cold. Upstream failure 1115, foundation shift 1203, overflow 0120, water accidents, structural failures. Each glowing footprint contained a prediction of disaster, and they formed a trail leading along the shoreline toward the dam's foundation. I counted 11 prints in total, with the final one dated 6 months in the future and marked with words that made my mouth go dry. Complete breach. The rational part of my mind rejected everything I was seeing. Stress-induced hallucinations, perhaps triggered by too many months of solitary night work. Pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns where none existed, combined with fatigue and an overactive imagination. I'd heard of similar cases among night shift workers, security guards who started seeing intruders in empty buildings, lighthouse keepers who reported phantom ships on calm seas. But the alternative explanation, that I'd witnessed something genuinely supernatural, was even more disturbing. If the women were real, if their predictions were accurate, then Millbrook Dam was heading toward catastrophic failure, and somehow the responsibility for preventing it had fallen to me. I spent the remainder of my shift researching the dates and locations mentioned in the footprints, dam maintenance records, geological surveys, weather predictions, anything that might validate or contradict what I'd seen. The upstream failure date corresponded with a scheduled inspection of a smaller dam 15 miles upriver. The foundation shift aligned with a minor earthquake predicted by seismic monitoring stations. The overflow date coincided with meteorologists' forecasts for unusually heavy winter rainfall. Coincidence was the obvious explanation, but as I dug deeper into historical records, I discovered something that made my skin crawl. Similar incidents had been reported at 3 other dam sites over the past decade, night workers describing women in white, strange animals, and glowing footprints that predicted disasters. In 2 cases, the predictions had proven accurate, leading to evacuations and emergency repairs that prevented catastrophic failures. The 3rd case was still classified, but the dam in question had been quietly decommissioned 6 months after the sighting. I began following the trail. Not physically at first. I wasn't ready for that level of commitment to what might be an elaborate delusion. Instead, I focused on monitoring the predicted dates, documenting any incidents that matched the cryptic warnings. When the upstream failure occurred exactly as foretold, a minor dam breach that required emergency repairs, I felt my grip on rational explanation begin to slip. The foundation shift came next, a minor seismic event that caused hairline cracks in the dam's eastern wall. Easily repairable, barely newsworthy, but precisely timed to match the glowing prediction. With each accurate forecast, my nights became increasingly sleepless, and my days were consumed with researching structural engineering, water management, and the growing list of dates that stretched toward the final, ominous notation. It was during the 4th week of my investigation that they returned. This time I was ready, my phone's UV light already activated as I patrolled the shoreline. The women appeared as suddenly as they had before, materializing from darkness as if stepping through an invisible curtain. I watched from a concealed position behind a concrete barrier, forcing myself to observe rather than interfere. Their ritual was more elaborate than my first glimpse had suggested. Each woman held multiple cats, always eyeless but alive, and their washing motions followed a precise pattern that reminded me of religious ceremonies. They worked in silence, their white dresses remaining impossibly clean despite their proximity to the muddy water. When they finished, the women didn't simply vanish. Instead, they turned as one toward my hiding place, and though I couldn't see their faces clearly, I felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. One of them raised her hand and pointed directly at me, then gestured toward the trail of footprints. The message was clear: follow us, or face the consequences. I waited until they disappeared before approaching the shoreline. New footprints had appeared, extending the trail further along the water's edge. Fresh dates, new predictions, all leading toward that final catastrophic notation that grew closer with each passing day. The following weeks blurred together in a haze of mounting paranoia and obsessive research. I requested maintenance reports for every component of the dam, studied weather patterns with the intensity of a meteorologist, and began to understand the delicate balance of forces that kept millions of gallons of water contained behind aging concrete. Every prediction from the glowing trail proved accurate, creating a pattern of minor failures and repairs that seemed designed to test my faith in the impossible. My supervisor noticed my deteriorating condition during our monthly check-in. Dark circles under my eyes, weight loss, and an increasing tendency to jump at sudden sounds had made me a liability rather than an asset. He suggested a medical leave, perhaps a psychiatric evaluation, but I convinced him I was simply dealing with insomnia related to shift work. The truth, that I was locked in a supernatural countdown toward disaster, wasn't something I could share without confirming his suspicions about my mental state. 3 dates remained on the trail when I finally decided to follow it to its conclusion. The decision came after another sleepless day spent staring at engineering diagrams and weather forecasts. If the women's predictions were accurate, and so far they'd been flawless, then Millbrook Dam was heading toward complete failure in less than 2 months. Thousands of people lived downstream. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, would be obliterated if the dam burst without warning. My responsibility as the night watchman suddenly felt enormous, far beyond my job description or qualifications. I began my final patrol at midnight, carrying extra equipment I'd assembled over the previous weeks. A more powerful UV light, a camera capable of low-light photography, and a small recorder in case the women spoke during their ritual. The trail had extended to nearly 50 footprints now, winding along the shoreline like a phosphorescent path toward some unimaginable destination. As I followed the glowing impressions, my sense of unease deepened with each step. The footprints were changing, becoming more distinct and detailed under UV light. Individual toe marks were clearly visible now, and strange symbols had begun appearing alongside the dates and warnings. The markings resembled no alphabet I recognized, but their meaning felt somehow accessible, as if my brain was slowly learning to decode their significance. The trail led me to a section of the dam I'd never explored thoroughly, a maintenance area where the original construction had left behind a maze of concrete channels and overflow pipes. Here, the water was deeper and darker, fed by underground springs that kept the temperature constant year-round. Steam rose from the surface like morning fog, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made me question whether I was still within the boundaries of normal reality. I found them waiting. 3 women in white, standing waist-deep in the steaming water, each holding a cat whose empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly into my soul. But now I could see their faces clearly, and the sight nearly made me turn and run. They were beautiful in the way that classical statues are beautiful, perfect features unmarked by time or weather, skin that seemed to glow with internal light. But their eyes were wrong, too large and too dark, filled with knowledge that no human should possess. The woman in the center spoke, and her voice carried the sound of rushing water over stone. She told me about the dam's true purpose, about the things that slept in the deep water, and the bargains that had been made during its construction. She explained that the predictions weren't warnings, they were offerings, a chance for someone to take responsibility for maintaining the balance between what was hidden and what was revealed. Following the trail to its end meant accepting that responsibility, becoming part of the dam's eternal watch. Refusing meant allowing the final breach to occur naturally, washing away not just the structure but everything it had been built to contain. As she spoke, I felt something changing in my reflection on the water's surface. My features were shifting, becoming more angular, my eyes growing larger and darker. The transformation wasn't painful, but it was irreversible, and I understood that this was what she'd meant about losing my face. The choice was mine: remain human and allow disaster, or accept transformation and become something else entirely. I reached toward the water, feeling its impossible warmth against my fingertips, and made my decision. That was 6 weeks ago. I still file my reports on schedule, still patrol the perimeter each night, but the maintenance workers have started commenting on my appearance. Thinner, they say. Eyes like pools. Skin that seems to catch moonlight even on cloudy nights. The dam hasn't failed. Each predicted disaster has been quietly prevented through repairs that I somehow knew were necessary, adjustments that I somehow understood how to make. The trail of footprints has disappeared, but I can still see them when I close my eyes, leading toward a future that no longer includes the possibility of catastrophic failure. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I see new figures standing in the shallow water. Men and women in work clothes, holding flashlights that cast no shadows, their faces bearing the same transformation I've undergone. Other watchers, other guardians, all of us bound to our posts by choices we made when following trails that led beyond human understanding. I tell myself, this is all elaborate fantasy, a complex delusion born from stress and isolation. But then I catch my reflection in the security office windows and see eyes that no longer look entirely human, and I know that some questions are more comfortable left unanswered. The water continues to flow safely past Millbrook Dam, held back by concrete and steel, and the watchful eyes of those who traded their faces for the responsibility of keeping ancient bargains intact. Whether that's blessing or curse, I'm no longer entirely sure. Story 13. The building came with more ghosts than I'd bargained for, though the realtor never mentioned them in her glossy brochures. 6 stories of crumbling brick and dubious wiring, carved into studio apartments sometime in the 1960s when landlords still believed in maximizing every square foot of misery. I'd bought it sight unseen, a mistake born of desperation and a favorable interest rate that seemed too good to be true. It was. The first tenant I met wasn't technically a tenant at all. He appeared on a Tuesday morning while I stood in the lobby, surveying water damage that resembled abstract art across the yellowed walls. The man materialized from the stairwell like smoke given form, tall, gaunt, wearing a wool coat that belonged to another decade. His eyes held the peculiar intensity of someone who'd been waiting far too long for a conversation. "You're the new owner," he said. Not a question. His voice carried the rasp of old cigarettes and older secrets. I confirmed this, introduced myself, extended a hand he didn't take. Instead, he studied my face with the methodical attention of someone reading fine print. "I need to inspect the 3rd fireplace," he announced, as if this were the most natural request in the world. The building had been retrofitted for central heating decades ago. Most fireplaces had been sealed, bricked over, forgotten. I told him this, explained that I was still learning the building's layout myself, that any inspections would need to wait until I'd completed my own assessment. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of disappointment, or perhaps recognition of an expected obstacle. "You don't understand," he said. "The 3rd fireplace, 4th floor, apartment 4C. It needs to be opened." The urgency in his voice made my skin crawl, though I couldn't explain why. I assured him I'd look into it, get back to him, asked for his contact information. He turned and walked away without providing it, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell long after he'd disappeared. That night, in my own apartment on the 6th floor, I tasted ashes for the first time. I woke with my mouth full of grit, the metallic tang of burnt wood coating my tongue. The sensation was so vivid, so immediate, that I stumbled to the bathroom expecting to find my teeth blackened with soot. Instead, I found my reflection staring back, pale and confused, mouth clean as fresh snow. The building creaked around me in ways that old buildings do. Pipes settling, wood expanding, the eternal conversation between gravity and architecture. But underneath these familiar sounds, I detected something else. A rhythmic thumping, distant but persistent, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. I told myself it was the heating system. Old boilers were notorious for irregular percussion. I made a mental note to have it inspected, though the sound seemed to emanate from below rather than the basement where the boiler lived. The next morning brought the first visible signs. Dark stains appeared on the lobby carpet overnight. Not water damage, but something finer, more invasive. Soot. It dusted the edges of the room like ash from an unseen fire, concentrated near the stairwell where the strange man had emerged. I spent an hour vacuuming, but the particles seemed to multiply rather than diminish, as if the building itself were exhaling them from some hidden lung. Mrs. Chen from 2B mentioned the smell during our brief encounter near the mailboxes. She wrinkled her nose, spoke in broken English about smoke in the walls, wondered if someone was burning trash in their apartment. I assured her I'd investigate, though I detected no smoke myself, only that persistent taste of ashes that now greeted me every morning. The man returned on Thursday. This time he waited outside, leaning against the brick facade like he'd grown there. His wool coat looked even more anachronistic in the harsh afternoon light, and I noticed details I'd missed before. The frayed cuffs, the way his fingers were stained yellow-brown, the fact that he cast a shadow that seemed deeper than shadows should be. "Have you considered my request?" he asked. I explained that I was still familiarizing myself with the building, that any structural modifications would require permits, inspections, probably more bureaucracy than either of us wanted to endure. The words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Excuses built on reasonable foundations but somehow inadequate to address whatever he was really asking. "Time is becoming a factor," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made the afternoon feel colder. "What kind of factor?" But he was already walking away, that same deliberate retreat that left me with more questions than I'd started with. That evening I climbed to the 4th floor and found apartment 4C. The current tenant, a graduate student named Marcus who paid his rent in exact change and rarely made eye contact, answered my knock with obvious reluctance. I explained that I needed to inspect the fireplace, cited general maintenance concerns. He stepped aside, though his expression suggested he found the request as strange as I did. The fireplace dominated the far wall of his studio, a massive brick structure that had been sealed with layers of plaster and paint. Someone had hung a mirror above the mantel, perhaps hoping to disguise its bulk, but the effect only emphasized its presence. The entire wall seemed to pulse with suppressed energy, though that might have been a trick of the lighting. "Has it made any sounds?" I asked. Marcus paused, his nervous fidgeting. "Sounds? Tapping, knocking, anything unusual?" He considered this with the earnest attention of someone who spent too much time alone. "Sometimes at night," he admitted, like someone trying to get out. The words hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to explore. I thanked him, promised to look into it, retreated to the hallway where the air felt less oppressive. But walking away felt like abandoning a post, leaving something unguarded that demanded vigilance. The thumping grew louder over the weekend. Not just louder, more insistent, more clearly defined. It followed a rhythm that seemed almost organic, a pulse that quickened during certain hours and slowed during others. Mrs. Chen mentioned it again, along with Mr. Petrov from the 3rd floor and even Marcus, who rarely acknowledged the existence of other tenants. The building was developing a heartbeat, and everyone could hear it. I called a contractor Monday morning, described the situation in terms of possible structural settling, maybe an issue with the heating system that was manifesting through the old fireplace flue. He agreed to take a look, though his tone suggested skepticism about my diagnostic abilities. But when he arrived Tuesday afternoon, the contractor couldn't locate the source of the sound. He spent 2 hours with various instruments, checking the boiler, examining pipes, tapping walls with the methodical patience of someone who believed in rational explanations. The building remained silent during his entire visit, as if it were holding its breath. "Everything seems normal," he concluded, packing his tools with the satisfied air of someone who'd solved a non-problem. "Old buildings make noise, part of their charm." The thumping resumed the moment his truck disappeared around the corner. By Wednesday, the soot had spread beyond the lobby. Tenants began complaining about dark residue appearing in their apartments, on windowsills, around door frames, collecting in corners like snow that fell upward instead of down. I hired a cleaning service, but they reported the same phenomenon I'd experienced. The particles seemed to regenerate faster than they could be removed. The taste of ashes had become constant, a metallic coating that no amount of brushing or mouthwash could eliminate. I began to wonder if the sensation was purely physical, or if something else was happening. Some kind of sympathetic response to whatever burned behind that sealed fireplace. Thursday brought the man back, but this time he didn't wait outside. I found him in the lobby, standing directly beneath the light fixture, studying the ceiling as if reading text written there. The soot seemed to swirl around him, drawn by some invisible current, and for a moment I wondered if he was its source rather than its herald. "The situation is deteriorating," he said without looking at me. I asked what he meant, though the building's condition made the question feel rhetorical. The heartbeat had grown strong enough to vibrate through the floor, a pulse that synchronized with my own until I couldn't tell where the building ended and I began. "The seal is weakening," he continued. "Soon it won't matter whether you grant permission or not." "Permission for what exactly?" He turned toward me then, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. Not malice, but pity. The look someone gives to a person who's about to understand something they'd rather not know. "To finish what was started," he said. "To let them breathe again." The pronoun hit me like cold water. Not it. Them. Who's them? But he was already moving toward the stairwell, his footsteps creating an echo that didn't match his pace. I followed, taking the stairs 2 at a time, but when I reached the 4th floor, the hallway was empty. The only sound was the thumping from behind Marcus's wall, stronger now, accompanied by what might have been scratching or whispers or both. I stood outside apartment 4C, listening to whatever lived behind the plaster, and understood that I was running out of time to make a choice I didn't want to make. That night, the building began to smoke. Not visible smoke, nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms or evacuate tenants. Instead, a presence filled the air, thick and suffocating, carrying the weight of old fires and older secrets. I lay in bed, breathing atmosphere that tasted like burnt offerings, while the heartbeat beneath the floors grew strong enough to shake the walls. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door at 3 a.m., speaking rapidly in Mandarin before switching to English fragmented by fear. The soot was appearing faster now, coating her apartment in layers that reformed as quickly as she cleaned them. Mr. Petrov reported the same phenomenon, along with Marcus and the other tenants, all describing a building that was slowly filling with ash from the inside out. "You have to do something," Mrs. Chen pleaded, and I promised I would, though I wasn't sure what form that something should take. Friday morning, I climbed to the 4th floor with a crowbar. Marcus wasn't home, probably at the library, avoiding whatever was happening in his apartment. I let myself in with the master key, stood before the sealed fireplace, and listened to the sounds emerging from behind the plaster, no longer just thumping, but a symphony of movement, scratching, shuffling, the whisper of voices that might have been wind through old masonry, or something far worse. The crowbar felt heavy in my hands, weighted with consequence. Breaking the seal would end the mystery, but mysteries exist for reasons. Some doors stay closed because opening them releases things that should remain contained. But the alternative was watching the building slowly suffocate under layers of supernatural soot, seeing my tenants driven away by phenomena I couldn't explain or control. The heartbeat had grown so strong that pictures rattled on walls, and the taste of ashes now followed me everywhere, coating my dreams with the flavor of old smoke. I positioned the crowbar against the plaster and hesitated. The building held its breath around me, waiting for a decision that felt larger than property management or tenant satisfaction. Whatever lived behind that wall had been sealed for decades, contained by previous owners who'd made the choice to keep it trapped rather than confront it. Now that responsibility had passed to me, along with the consequences of whatever I decided. The thumping intensified, synchronized with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell which was which. The voices behind the plaster grew clearer, though I couldn't make out words, only the desperate urgency of things that had been waiting too long for release. I thought about the man in the wool coat, his stained fingers and too deep shadow, his certainty that time was running out. Had he been one of them, somehow escaped or specially chosen as their messenger? Or was he something else entirely, an advocate for forces I didn't understand? The building shuddered around me, and dust rained from the ceiling like benediction or warning. I raised the crowbar, positioned it against the seal, and prepared to discover what happens when you break promises made by other people in other decades for reasons that died with them. The plaster cracked under pressure, revealing darkness that seemed to breathe, and from that darkness came the sound of gratitude or hunger. I never learned which. Because in that moment, standing in Marcus's apartment with ancient dust coating my hands and the taste of ashes finally making sense, I understood that some questions are answered not by revelation, but by living with the consequences of asking them. The building still stands. The heartbeat continues. And every morning, I wake with the certainty that I've made a choice that will define the rest of whatever time I have left. Whether that was the right choice depends entirely on what you believe about the nature of seals, and why some things are meant to stay buried. The man in the wool coat hasn't returned. He doesn't need to. Story 14. The red-eye from Chicago to Denver should have been routine. 37,000 feet, half-empty cabin, passengers settling into that peculiar airplane silence where strangers pretend not to exist. I'd been working these overnight flights for 8 years, long enough to recognize the rhythm of a smooth journey. But tonight felt different from the moment I stepped aboard Flight 447. The first sign wasn't the passenger in 14C, though he'd prove significant later. It was the air itself, thick with an electric tension I couldn't name. The cabin light seemed dimmer than usual, casting shadows that lingered too long in the corners of my vision. Even the familiar hum of the engines carried an odd undertone, like a distant conversation just beyond comprehension. I was completing my safety check when I noticed him, middle-aged, unremarkable in every way except for his complete stillness. While other passengers fidgeted with phones or settled into sleep positions, he sat perfectly motionless, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at the seatback. Beside him, on the floor, sat a carrier containing what appeared to be a bulldog. The documentation checked out. Emotional support animal, all the proper paperwork. But something about the setup bothered me. The passenger hadn't acknowledged the dog once since boarding, never reached down to comfort or check on the animal. Most people with emotional support pets maintained constant contact, a reassuring touch or whispered word. This man acted as if the carrier contained luggage. 20 minutes into the flight, I heard the first bark. It wasn't the typical stressed whine of a nervous animal. This was different, a hollow, reverberating sound that seemed to echo from somewhere much larger than the small cabin space. The bark carried an electronic quality, like audio played through a speaker with failing connections. Other passengers stirred uncomfortably, but no one commented. The man in 14C remained statue still. I approached his row during beverage service, hoping to get a better look at the animal. Through the carrier's mesh window, I glimpsed the bulldog's face and felt my stomach drop. Its eyes were completely white, not the cloudy white of blindness, but the glossy, artificial white of glass marbles. They stared forward without blinking, without any sign of life behind them. Yet when I leaned closer, that hollow bark erupted again, and I swear the sound came from everywhere at once. The man finally spoke when I asked if he needed anything for his pet. His voice was flat, emotionless. He doesn't need anything. He's just listening. Listening to what? I wanted to ask, but something in the man's tone suggested the conversation was over. The next hour passed in mounting unease. The barking continued at irregular intervals, sometimes a single hollow woof, sometimes a series of 3 or 4. Each time, other passengers glanced around nervously, but the source was always that impossible-looking dog in 14C. I found myself timing the barks, noting their pattern, though I couldn't say why this felt important. It was during my third pass through the cabin that I noticed the timing matched something else. The captain's course corrections. Every time that hollow bark echoed through the cabin, I felt the subtle shift as our flight path adjusted slightly left or right. The changes were minimal, the kind most passengers wouldn't notice, but after 8 years of reading an aircraft's movements through my feet, I knew we were deviating from our planned route. I headed to the galley and called the cockpit on the interphone. Captain Morrison answered on the second ring, his voice tight with concentration. "Everything all right up there?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "We're tracking an intermittent signal on radar," he replied. "Appears and disappears without pattern. Air traffic control doesn't show anything in our vicinity, so we're making minor adjustments to maintain safe distance. My mouth went dry. How long has this been happening? About an hour. Signal strength varies, but it seems to respond to something, almost like it's tracking us. The line went quiet except for the steady thrum of engines. In the background, I heard that hollow bark echo through the cabin again, and through the phone I caught the faint beep of the radar contact appearing on their screen. "I'll let you know if we need anything," Morrison said, ending the call. I stood in the galley, hands trembling as I processed the impossible connection. Every time the dog barked, the radar contact appeared. When silence returned, the signal faded. It defied every rational explanation I could construct, yet the pattern was undeniable. I returned to 14C, studying the carrier more carefully. The bulldog sat in the same position, those glass eyes staring at nothing, but now I noticed other details that chilled me further. Its chest didn't rise and fall with breathing. Its tongue, visible between slightly parted jaws, looked dried and artificial. When it barked again, I watched closely and saw no movement of throat or mouth. The sound simply emanated from somewhere within the carrier, like a recording playing on loop. "Sir," I addressed the man, my voice barely steady, "is your dog feeling all right? He seems still." The man turned his head toward me for the first time since boarding. His eyes held the same glassy quality as the animal's. "He's not my dog. He's theirs. He's just the speaker." Before I could ask what he meant, another bark filled the cabin, louder than before. This time, several passengers sat up, looking around with obvious alarm. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and I felt the aircraft bank more sharply to the left. I needed to do something, but what? Report a possibly supernatural occurrence to the captain? Confiscate an emotional support animal based on a paranoid theory? My training provided no protocols for this situation. The man spoke again, his voice carrying a strange urgency. "It's getting stronger. The connection. Each time he calls out, they get closer to finding us." "Who's finding us?" He gestured upward with one finger toward the ceiling, toward the empty sky above. "The ones who've been waiting. The ones he belongs to." My rational mind rejected every word, but my instincts screamed warnings I couldn't ignore. The barking was definitely getting louder, more frequent. The course corrections were becoming more pronounced. Whatever was happening, it was escalating. I made a decision that felt both crazy and necessary. During the next quiet period, when the barking stopped and the cabin returned to relative calm, I approached the carrier. The man didn't object as I carefully lifted it from the floor. "I need to relocate your pet for the safety of other passengers," I said, using my most official tone. He nodded slowly. "You can try, but stopping the signal won't stop what's coming. It'll just delay it." I carried the carrier to the rear galley and closed it inside a service cabinet. The immediate effect was startling. The cabin fell into a deeper quiet than I'd heard all night. Passengers visibly relaxed, some returning to sleep. But most telling was the change in our flight path. Within minutes, we resumed our original course toward Denver. I called the cockpit again. Morrison sounded relieved. "Whatever that signal was, it's moving away from us, distance increasing rapidly." For the first time in hours, I felt I could breathe normally. Whatever connection existed between the dog and the radar contact, breaking line of sight seemed to have severed it. We were safe, but as I stood in the galley, staring at the closed cabinet door, doubt crept in. Was I losing my mind? Had I fabricated this entire scenario? The stress of night flights, the isolation, the responsibility. Maybe it had finally gotten to me. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown and seeing patterns that didn't exist. The doubt lasted exactly 11 minutes. That's when the barking resumed, muffled but unmistakable, echoing from inside the closed cabinet. But this time, it wasn't alone. From somewhere above the aircraft, somewhere in the empty sky at 37,000 feet, came an answering call. It started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across vast distances. But as the cabinet muffled barks continued, the external sound grew closer, more distinct. It wasn't thunder. It was the same hollow, artificial bark, but magnified 1,000-fold, as if something massive was responding to the small signal below. The aircraft began to shake. Not turbulence. I knew turbulence. This was something pressing against the hull from outside, something large enough to affect our entire flight path. Passengers were awake now, gripping armrests, looking around with growing panic. I opened the cabinet door, and the dog's barking immediately became clearer, more insistent. The external response intensified accordingly, and I felt the aircraft lurch upward as if something was trying to lift us from below. The man from 14C appeared in the galley doorway, his glass eyes reflecting the emergency lighting that had automatically activated. "Now you understand," he said. "He's not calling for help. He's calling them home." I stood frozen between two impossible choices. Keep the dog contained and hope whatever was outside would eventually lose interest, or release it and allow the signal to strengthen, drawing us towards something I couldn't even imagine. The external barking was directly overhead now, so loud it drowned out the engines. The aircraft groaned under stress it wasn't designed to handle. In the cabin, passengers were crying, praying, demanding answers I couldn't give. My hand hovered over the carrier handle. Inside, those glass eyes stared up at me, unblinking, while that hollow voice continued its mechanical calls. Above us, something vast and patient waited for a clear signal to complete its descent. The choice was simple, even if the consequences weren't. Maintain the fragile barrier between them and risk our aircraft being torn apart, or open the channel completely and discover what had been hunting us through the clouds. I thought about my 8 years of routine flights, my certainty that I understood how the world worked, how physics and logic governed everything from takeoff to landing. That certainty was gone now, replaced by the knowledge that something else shared our sky, something that used impossible dogs as beacons to find aircraft full of people it wanted to. What? Take? Study? The man had never said. The barking above grew so loud that metal panels started vibrating loose. Emergency lights flashed in sequence. Whatever I was going to do, it had to be now. I reached for the carrier handle, my decision made, though I couldn't say which way I was going to choose. As my fingers touched the metal, the external barking suddenly stopped. Complete silence fell over the aircraft. No engine noise, no air circulation, no sound at all. We hung motionless in the sky, 37,000 feet above the earth, suspended between physics and something else entirely. In that impossible quiet, I heard one final sound, my own voice, hollow and electronic, coming from inside the carrier. "Found you," it said, in a perfect mimicry of my words. I looked down at my hands and saw they were trembling. But in the carrier's reflection, they weren't my hands at all. They were glass, unblinking, staring up at something I was only beginning to understand. The man from 14C smiled with artificial lips. "Welcome aboard," he said, though his mouth never moved. Outside the windows, the clouds began to part, revealing lights that had never belonged to any earthly sky. And somewhere in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, came the sound of engines that ran on frequencies no human ear was meant to hear. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be certain about anything. When I opened them again, the world looked exactly the same, but I knew with absolute clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. The choice had already been made. It always had been. All that remained was to discover which side of the equation I'd been on from the very beginning.